Warning, warning, warning. Okay, now you've just gone ahead and clicked play on this training. You've seen the timestamp and you're like, what in the world? This is a big warning for you. Do not get overwhelmed. Before we start this training, I want to go ahead and emphasize this training that you are about to go through is similar to a seminar, okay? We could have broken it up into like 10 different trainings, but we chose to actually put it all together in one training. And so what that means, it means that there are going to be required breaks within this specific training. They're going to be indicated and you're going to see them flashing on the screen. That means that you will be required to take a break because of the fact that this is way too much information for you to just get all in one sitting, okay? So I would highly not recommend going through this training in one sitting. And I would also urge you, do not get overwhelmed. We're going to take it step by step. We're going to do this together. So just stick with me. But I just want to go ahead and put this warning from the very beginning, okay? I urge you, don't get overwhelmed. We're going to do this together. Do not worry about the timestamp on this training because like I said, this training is more like a seminar and we are going to be taking breaks throughout it so that way you can make sure that you are getting the most out of this specific training. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start the training right now. Hey team, Yasin here, and in this training, we're going to be going over how much to eat. Now, I do want to go ahead and emphasize from the very beginning of this training, I know sometimes the beginning of these introductions and the beginning of these trainings can be a lot of repetition, but the reason why it's important to make sure that you do not skip ahead inside of these trainings, and the reason why it's important for you to actually listen to me as I go ahead and walk you through this introduction is because I do a lot of times tweak the beginnings of these introductions specifically for the training that we're going to be talking about, okay? So I would urge you to make sure that you watch every single training in full. Don't skip ahead, okay? If you got to watch it at 1.5x speed, that's understandable, but in terms of skipping, I do not recommend skipping ahead. Now, with that being said, let's talk about why this training is important. So inside of this training, we are continuing our theme of the science of transformation, and we're going to be looking at the second how question of nutrition, right? So we've talked about the 4 pillars: nutrition, movement, sleep, and recharge, and we are right now talking about nutrition. Now, always remember what we are also doing throughout this entire process is we are laying the foundations for you to have your own personal transformation, as well as you to be able to coach others through their transformation as well. And so, yes, I know getting your certification in remote wellness is not going to be easy. It is not going to be an overnight process, but I promise you it is absolutely going to transform your life for the rest of your life. And so it is absolutely worth it. The second very important point that I want to talk to you about in the introduction of this training is just to recap on, if you remember where we are so far in the 3 how questions of nutrition. We said that we're going to be talking about 3 questions. The very first one that we spoke about in the previous training was how much to burn. And now, right now, we are talking about how much to eat. And then we are next going to talk about how to eat. And so all 3 of these questions are equally important and absolutely critical, okay? Because at the end of the day, if you do not understand the content that is inside of these 3 trainings, then you will be unable to undergo a transformation for yourself, and you'll be unable to help other students with this as well, okay? So those are 2 very important points I wanted to go ahead and emphasize in the beginning of this training. The other very important point that I want to go ahead and emphasize for you as we start to go into this training is I want to talk to you really quickly about screenshots of money that you see on social media. In said a different way, screenshots of money, okay? I know some students really love it when I say money like that, okay? So I want to talk to you about, as we go through these trainings, some students, yes, of course, not you, but some students other than you start to get impatient and they say, hey, Coach Yasin, right? I'm starting to get money hungry and I just want to really start to make money as of yesterday, right? And what I want to show you here for a second is I want to show you something. Here are a few screenshots from my friend's Amazon seller account, okay? Right here you can see he did 10 grand in the last 30 days. And you can see right here in the last 12 months, he's done just over $200,000 in just 12 months, okay? So when you see these screenshots, for you, as you're seeing them, you say, wow, that's amazing, right? He made 10 grand in the last 30 days and he made over $200,000 in the last 12 months. You'll look at that and you'll be like, wow, that's amazing. Well, here's the thing. If I show you how much he had left over after paying himself, here's a screenshot from his Chase account, okay? And if I show you right here, this is how much money he had left over after paying himself only $2,000 per month for the entire year, after doing $200,000 over the last 12 months. This is how much money he had left over after only paying himself $2,000. And so this is the point that I want you to understand. As you are going through this program right now, I'm sure you are still getting hit with all of these other ads from all of these other business opportunities, right? They're telling you, hey, do Amazon FBA, hey, do wholesale, do stocks, do drop shipping, right? Whatever other new opportunity has come up. They're telling you, hey, this guy right here, here's his screenshot. He did 30 grand in the last 6 months, right? And you might be thinking, man, I'm sitting inside of this training, listening to this guy, Coach Yasin, this guy talking about trying to get my remote wellness certification when I could be out there doing $30,000 a month within the next 6 months. I cannot tell you how many beginner and amateur income earners, specifically online income earners, this messes up, okay? Because what you don't see behind the scenes is how much this person is actually making. That's point number one. And then the second point is you have no idea what this person's past experience has been within that business opportunity. And then in fact, most of these screenshots, a lot of times these people are only making 10% margins before they pay their expenses. How do I know this? I know this because here is screenshots from just one of my own Amazon seller accounts from back in the day. Because the truth is that total across all of my e-commerce businesses in this year that I'm showing you this screenshot for, I did $3.2 million in a single year. Okay, this is screenshots from one of my Amazon seller accounts from back in the day when I was running my own e-commerce businesses. Okay, now here's the thing. My take home for that entire year when I did $3.2 million was about $300,000 take home. Okay, now you might be seeing that number and you say, wow, Coach Yasin, that's great. I would love to make $300,000 a year. Now remember, that's off of $3.2 million top line, okay? But what you also didn't see was the 10-person team that I was running behind the scenes. You didn't see the office and the warehouse and all of the stress that came alongside that business. This is exactly the reason why I sold that business in 2018 and I got sick and tired of all of the logistics, okay? And so what I'm urging you to do is I'm urging you not to get fooled with the screenshots and numbers and all these other business opportunities that exist out there, okay? What I want you to know is that your coaches here at RWA, we are veterans in the make money online space. And so we know exactly what is happening behind the scenes, okay? And so you are a part of this program and we are here to guide you in your journey of making money online and remotely. And so if you have questions, if you feel like you are losing faith in your remote wellness journey, talk to us, hop on a coaching call. We'll help you get focused again and we'll talk to you about what's actually happening behind the scenes. And so this entire introduction to this section is where I'm just urging you, do not fall into what these gurus are trying to sell you based on all these other ads that you might be getting, okay? So you're a good portion into the RWA program. And so it's typically at around this portion that students start to feel a little bit disheartened. They're like, man, I'm going through all these long trainings. I'm trying to get this remote wellness certification. I don't see or understand fully how this is all going to work into monetization. I'm just urging you, if you're losing faith, hop on a coaching call. We'll help you get focused again, but do not fall prey to all of these other business opportunities that exist out there. Now, my last point that I want to go ahead and cover before we jump into the meat and potatoes of this training is, are these trainings going to be longer? One word, yes, period. Why? Because of the fact that when we are talking about these topics related to health, okay, when we talk about these topics, it's really difficult to be able to sit down and explain these advanced topics, or these deeper topics, I should rather say. They're not advanced, they're just foundational, fundamental, but you can't explain them in a 5-second TikTok, Instagram story, okay? And so this is why it's so important for you to be able to study some of these foundational basic topics. But remember, you can break this training up. You do not have to consume it in one sitting. You can break it up into 15, 30-minute, 1-hour increments, whatever it might be. And just remember, over time, the more you focus, the better you're going to get. It's just like practicing, just like you would with a muscle, okay? So just keep in mind, you don't have to do this in one sitting, and just pinky promise me, like you always have, because you've been such an amazing student. Just pinky promise me that you're going to take a deep breath, you're not going to get overwhelmed, and we're going to get through this together. So enough with the introduction. Let's go ahead and hop into the actual training. I went ahead and included for you guys a training outline in the beginning of this training as well. But let's go ahead and talk about the very first thing, which is how much to burn and eat. So if you remember, in the previous training, we spoke about how all diets work, right? We spoke about how calories are just energy and how fat is just potential stored energy, and how our bodies are able to store precious energy when the tank gets full, right? And what we did was we compared our cars to what our cars do versus what our bodies do, right? And so we said that our cars, once they get to the full point inside of the gas tank, they go ahead and they cannot go anymore, right? They have a fuel overflow. They cannot store any more fuel after they get to that point. But our bodies, on the other hand, we said have this amazing ability to continue fueling past the full point, and they just store extra energy, extra amounts of energy in reserve, right? And then we also spoke about how amazing the body was on the reverse of this. We said that when our cars hit the empty point on the fuel tank, we said that they stop and they're unable to function any longer. Versus what our bodies do is that they continue to run well past the empty point of our fuel tanks by tapping into the stored energy reserves, aka fat, in order to fuel us and keep us alive. Remember, I'm just going through this very quickly. This is all just a recap of what we spoke about in the last training, right? And then on top of that, we spoke about because fat on our body is just stored energy, we can actually calculate how much energy is in a pound of fat. And we said there are 3,500 units of energy inside 1 pound of fat. How many? 3,500 calories, aka units of energy, inside of 1 pound of fat, right? And then from this, we came up with our basic equation to how all fat loss, muscle gain, and maintenance works. We said it's just energy you eat minus energy you burn equals the energy which is a maintenance, surplus, or deficit, right? And we said, hey, you can mess around with this through the energy you eat part, you can mess around with this through the energy you burn part, or a combination of both. And so this is how we ultimately said how all diets work. It does not matter what diet it is. For the means and purposes of weight loss, it's all about putting yourself into a caloric deficit, right? We said this is the only way to lose fat, which is eat less calories than you are burning every single day. And so the emphasis here is that no one is immune to a caloric deficit, right? People may lose weight faster or slower depending on if they're a Prius or a Hummer. Remember we talked about that? But everyone loses fat on a caloric deficit eventually. As long as you're in a caloric deficit, it does not matter how you are in a caloric deficit. As long as you are in a caloric deficit, you will lose fat. Now, of course, remember, as we also spoke about, similarly, the only way to gain weight is on a caloric surplus. So that means that your thyroid, the medications, and all that kind of stuff cannot increase your weight. The only thing that can increase your weight is a caloric surplus. So this is all just a recap of what we spoke about last time, right? And then after that, once we went ahead and talked about that in the last training, we then said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and now focus on the part of the equation that is the energy you burn piece. Because we said that once we understand how you burn energy, then it's going to be very easy for us in this training to be able to go into talking about the energy you eat piece. And so what we did is we went ahead and dived into the 5 levels of metabolism, and we said, wow, we really understand metabolism now all the way from level 1 all the way to level 5. And we said, okay, now that we understand the energy you burn, the metabolism, is made up of a number of pieces, we said that we can now look at how we can influence this in order to actually increase or decrease the amount that we burn. And so we said, hey, we can influence our NEAT, right? We can go ahead and influence how much walking and steps that we are doing, our non-exercise activity. We can influence our EAT, which is how much exercise activity we are doing. And we can influence our TEF, which is if we went ahead and ate more protein and fats, we would be able to influence that as well. And then to a degree, BMR can be influenced depending on the history of the diet or XYZ, right? And so from all of this is just a recap. From all of this, we went ahead and said, okay, cool. This piece of the equation right here that was energy you burn, this is now our most up-to-date understanding of where we are so far. So energy you burn is total daily energy expenditure which is metabolism, that is made up of these different aspects, okay? And then we said that we learned all of that through the different levels, so that way we could custom tailor the definition of metabolism to the level of person that we are talking about, okay? So if we want to get ahead and put all of this together so far in our journey, this is what all of that looks like, okay? So inside of this equation, we have energy you eat, which is what we're going to talk about inside of this training. And then this is where we are so far inside of the energy equation that we have been continuing inside of this series. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and now focus on the energy you eat piece of this entire process, okay? So now that we have a good understanding of the calories burned part inside of this table right here, right? We talked about this table in the past. We said, cool, calories eaten minus calories burned equals the deficit or the surplus. And then as long as you burn 3,500 calories over X amount of time, then you would be burning 1 pound of fat, right? So now that we understand this part, it's now time for us to go ahead and talk about the calories eaten section of this table. So that way we can actually focus on how much to eat, okay? And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and answer that question inside of this training, which is how much to eat. But here's the thing. If I went ahead and told you right now that for your goals, you needed to eat 2,500 calories split between 260 grams of carbs, 180 grams of protein, and 80 grams of fat. Would that make any sense to you? Would you know how to calculate how many calories that you've eaten? How many grams of carbs, proteins, or fats that you've eaten? Would you have any idea of what I was talking about? Now, for most students, it might not be you, but for most students, the truth is that they probably don't have any idea of what I'm talking about when I say, hey, 2,500 calories split between these grams of macronutrients. And so the truth is that before we can talk about how much to eat, we actually need to go ahead and first talk about how to measure and track how much we eat. Okay, and so visually, this is what it looks like. We need to go ahead and put a pause on how much to eat, and we need to go ahead and learn how to track and measure how much we eat. Why is that the case? Why do we need to go ahead and talk about measuring and tracking? The reason why this is the case is because if you don't understand how to measure and track how much you eat, then when I go ahead and tell you, hey, you got to eat 2,500 calories, 80 grams of this, 50 grams of that, 90 grams of that, it's not going to make sense. However, if we go ahead and understand how to measure and track how much we eat, and then we come back to this how much to eat section and we go ahead and hit that play button, it's going to be very easy for you to understand what it is that we are talking about at that time. Does that make sense? And so that is why for the first half of this training, we're going to go ahead and first talk about this, and then we are going to go ahead and return to the question of how much to eat. So let's go ahead and without further ado, jump right into talking about food measuring and food tracking. So the very first question that students have when they hear food measuring and food tracking is, what is food measuring and what is food tracking, right? So maybe you've heard about counting calories in the past. Maybe you yourself have tried counting calories in the past, right? Maybe you've heard of apps like MyFitnessPal or Lose It or something like that, right? And for most people who don't understand what food measuring and tracking actually is, there are many people who actually carry false beliefs around what counting calories actually is. Because here's the truth. Listen to me very carefully. Here's the truth. Regardless of if you choose to measure or track your food is always still being tracked by your body. What does that mean? It means that because you don't know exactly how many calories you're eating, it doesn't matter because your body still knows how many calories it's actually eating, okay? Because if you eat more than the amount of calories that you burn in a single day, okay, you will put on fat, regardless of if you know how many calories that was or not. So the choice is yours, ultimately. The choice is yours as to whether or not you want to put your head in the sand and not know how many calories you are eating, to not be informed on how many calories you're eating. But regardless of if you choose to do that, calories are still being counted by someone. Either you are doing it, your body's doing it, or both. And truthfully, your body's always doing it. So it's either going to be, you can either be informed about it or you cannot be informed about it, okay? And so ultimately, this is why it's very important to not have these false beliefs around tracking, okay? Because let me show you why measuring and tracking is so important. Let me go ahead and talk to you about a principle that is going to go ahead and change the way that you see food measuring and tracking and really your entire life as a whole, okay? Because here's a question for you. Have you ever heard of something called the Hawthorne study? It was basically a study that was conducted in the early to mid 1900s. And inside of that study, what they were doing is they were examining how different aspects of work environments, such as lighting and breaks and length of workday, would affect worker productivity. Okay, so they basically went into a factory and they said, cool, we're going to mess with a lot of different factors regarding how the workers are working. And we want to see, hey, can we make productivity go up? What are the factors that affect worker productivity? Okay, so what they did was they went in and they changed a bunch of things. They changed the bulbs from fluorescent bulbs to film bulbs, and guess what? Worker productivity went up. They changed the length of the worker's break time, and guess what? Worker productivity went up. They changed the length of the workday, and guess what? Worker productivity went up. And so they said, okay, cool. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go ahead and change back to the original all of these different things. So they went ahead and changed the bulbs back to what they used to be before. And guess what? The worker productivity still went up. They went in and they changed the break time to what it used to be before, and the worker productivity still went up. They went ahead and changed the length of the workday back to what it used to be before, and guess what? The worker productivity still went up. And so by the end of it, they had literally now made everything exactly the same way as it was before, and worker productivity was still up. And they're like, dang, what in the world is happening here, right? It's exactly the same thing that when we started this entire study, and now worker productivity is still up. Why? It was then that they realized that it wasn't the change in the lighting, it wasn't the change in the break time, it wasn't the change in the workday that was making productivity go up. It was the fact that the workers' productivity was being measured for the very first time. And that is the reason why productivity was going up. And so this has been coined what is known as the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is basically that we as humans have this tendency to change our behavior simply because of the fact that it is being evaluated, studied, or measured, okay? And so just from this fact, we understand that when things are being measured, we as humans perform differently. And so this is why the famous quote exists. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time from Peter Drucker. He said, what gets measured gets managed. And so right now, although we are applying this principle specifically in regards to food, what I want you to know is that this applies not only to all of the pillars of health, it also applies to every area of life that exists. And so when we get to the business and income portion of this program, you're going to see that we're going to be applying this exact principle inside of that part of our lives as well. And so the bottom line of all of this is this: measuring and tracking and having data around your goals will ensure that you have more success with them, okay? And so this same goes for when we measure and track our food. Regardless of what your beliefs and thoughts and emotions around measuring and tracking food are, measuring and tracking food is the most effective way to get to your goals when it comes to nutrition, bar none, period. And so this, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of measuring your food. And this has been proven over and over and over and over again, okay? Does measuring and tracking food help? Absolutely. You'll see here, this was a study. Participants in this study, when they did this, it was proven to be the most effective way to lose weight. And so if you struggle with thoughts and emotions and beliefs around tracking and measuring food, obviously we are here to help you as your coaches. But also I want you to refer back to module number 2 around navigating your thoughts and emotions and beliefs. Because ultimately the truth is that when you actually measure and track, it is the difference between flying blindfolded towards your goals and having a map towards your goals. You can literally choose to fly blindfolded and try to just navigate your way to your goals, or you can choose to have a map that's going to actually tell you exactly how is it that you are going to get to your goals. And so if you choose not to track, if you choose not to measure, then you're literally flying blindfolded because you have no idea if you are even on the right track and how much food you actually need to eat. And so I would urge you not to be like this guy right here and to instead have and measure and track food. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about inside of this training on how to do the measuring and the tracking in a way that is not overwhelming, in a way that is conducive to your lifestyle, so that way it is ultimately sustainable. Now, one of the questions that students sometimes have when they first hear and learn about measuring and tracking food and they first start to get introduced to this entire concept is they say, you know what, I'm just going to estimate, right? They're very quick into saying, food measuring and tracking, you know what? I don't even know what it is. I haven't even heard about what it is yet, but I don't care what it is. I'm just going to estimate from the very beginning, right? Why am I going to estimate? Because I think that I'm pretty good at estimating. Well, sir or madam, the research and the data would beg to differ, okay? Because the truth is that humans are actually terrible at estimating. It's the truth. Like really, really, really bad at estimating and guesstimating, okay? And so when students and people say, you know what, I'm just going to eyeball the amount of food that I'm eating, the truth is that estimating and guesstimating and eyeballing your food, it's just not a thing. If you're literally going to be like, yo, I'm going to look at this piece of chicken and I'm going to estimate how much it weighs and how many calories are in it, it's not going to happen, okay? And so to think that you would be the exception, I would just urge you to think again, okay? Because do not be one of those people who thinks that they are an exception to the human race, okay? Because at the end of the day, you are still human. And so don't fall into the trap of thinking that you can eyeball your food, because I promise you, you will always overeat when you do that. Now, the other point that I want to go ahead and bring your attention to in here as we talk about the introduction of measuring and tracking your food. So don't worry, we're going to get here to a second and talk about how exactly you're going to measure and track your food. But I'm just going to kind of address some of the false beliefs and limiting beliefs that many people have around this. Okay. So the other one that a lot of people typically and sometimes have is to say, hey, why measure and track food? It's not natural, right? They bring up a very good point, and some people say, hey, our ancestors for 99% of human history literally never and measured or tracked their food. And so this, what you are saying, Coach Yasin, is unnatural. And my response to them is I say, yep, I agree. Tracking and measuring your food is unnatural. And then the response is, huh? Coach Yasin, what are you saying? You're agreeing with us? You're agreeing that measuring and tracking your food is unnatural, right? If it's unnatural, coach, then why are you saying that we must measure and track our food? Well, let me explain. Because for 99% of human history, we also didn't have refrigerators. We also didn't have super stimuli foods. We also didn't have a global supply chain that allowed pretty much anyone in an industrialized country to have unlimited food. And so guess what? The conditions in which we are living in today's world are also unnatural. And so for 99% of human history, the most important resource ever, period, was food. And so for 99% of human history, food was actually always scarce. And so here is the bottom line truth. If we leave ourselves to rely on our default programming, then we are going to behave exactly like our ancestors did when food was available. Our ancestors, what they did when food was available is that they ate as much of the food as they could in the time that the food was available, because there would come a time for our ancestors in which food was not available. Okay? And so if you want to do that, by all means, please go ahead and do that. Please go ahead and eat as much food as you can during the time that the food is available to you. But here's the thing, and here's the problem with that. Unlike our ancestors, and unlike the time in which our ancestors lived, there is not going to come a time in which food is not available for you in the modern world. And guess what's going to happen then? Since the food is always available in our modern world, what we are going to do is we are going to continue eating because that is the way that our brains are programmed, okay? And we already talked about what happens when humans keep on eating past their full tank, right? We already talked about that. They literally store it as fat. And so for those who want to insistently argue that measuring and tracking food is not natural and therefore that is the reason why we shouldn't do it, then I say, hey, by all means, please go ahead. Don't measure or track your food. And then also, please go ahead and let me know when you do get back to living into a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where you have to be on your feet pretty much moving all day long, and when you're not sitting in an air-conditioned home on our butts for dozens of hours a day, okay? And so until that time comes where we are going back and living into a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, right? We're just gonna have to get used to doing things that our ancestors did not do. We are going to have to get used to doing things differently than 99% of human history, because we are living in a time in which 99% of humans did not also live in, okay? And so do you think that for a second, we are going to have to learn different skills for the time that we are living in based off of the resources that we have now in the modern world? Maybe, just maybe. What do you think? Right? And so the bottom line is this: without food measuring and tracking, humans will do what humans do best, is that we will continue to be tempted by all the food that is available, because in the modern world, food is unlimited and food is always available. It's literally just how our brains are programmed. And guess what? When food is not available for somebody in the modern world, in industrialized countries, guess what happens? The government steps in and makes food available for that person. Do you think our ancestors in hunter and gatherer times had a government that stepped in to make sure that they were giving them food? No, our hunter-gatherer ancestors just ended up dying from starvation because they weren't able to get food. And so you can see the times are completely different, and so the argument is completely nonsensical. Now, you might say, after hearing about that, hey, Coach Yasin, if measuring and tracking my food is so important, then how come no one has ever talked to me about how important it actually is? Well, the truth is that you can just add that point to the massive list of all of the other things that school and society never taught us before, and yet are so absolutely critical to living as an adult and a human being in the modern times. Like, I mean, do you remember everything we talked about in Module 2? Literally, how much of Module 2 was so critical to you functioning as an adult, as a human being in the modern day society? And yet, school and society and the vast majority of education that you've ever gone through never talked to you about anything that was in Module 2, right? And so this is exactly the same reason why 74% of society is overweight. According to the CDC, 74% of adults in the United States are overweight. Now, somebody might consistently insist. They say, but Coach Yasin, this is only in the United States, right? I'm sure it's different in other parts of the world because, hey, we know those Americans, those silly Americans, they're fat. We know that this might be something that's only American related. My response to that? Oh, really? Well, let's look at the data. Is obesity on the rise in Europe? Obesity has reached epidemic proportions in Europe. Okay, well, is obesity on the rise in Asia? Obesity has reached epidemic proportions in Asian countries. Is obesity on the rise in Africa? Obesity has reached epidemic proportions in Africa. Is obesity on the rise in Australia? Obesity has reached epidemic proportions in Australia. Is obesity on the rise in South America? Again, the same exact thing. Where else do you want to check, right? Let's check the continent. We've already gone through all the other continents. Let's check the continent of Antarctica, okay? Well, unfortunately, Antarctica is the only continent where there is no permanent human habitation. So maybe that is the only continent in which obesity is not an epidemic problem, okay? But the bottom line is that if you look at all of the continents that actually have permanent human habitation, okay, obesity is on the rise, period. And then in fact, obesity has actually tripled worldwide since 1975. Now, is it a coincidence that in the last 50 years, 1975, around that time frame, that is also the time in which the worldwide global supply chain has existed, so that way there is unlimited amounts of food for everyone? That probably isn't a coincidence, right? And so the epidemic of obesity is as a result of the fact that we have unlimited amounts of food around us, and we are just defaulting to our natural human programming. And this is exactly why these trainings and this module that you are going through are going to equip you with the necessary skills, so that way you cannot be a part of this problem. Because all of what we are talking about means something very particular. It means that until we learn new skills to handle this new modern world in which we live in, where there is unlimited food, humans will continue to eat because that is exactly how our brains are programmed. And yet, if this is the fact, which it is, if this is the fact, when was the last time anyone ever taught you or the people around you, or your students for that matter, the skills of food measuring and tracking in order to help you navigate this world of unlimited food? Probably never, right? And so the bottom line truth for all of this is that school and society has never taught its people the basic skill set of measuring and tracking food. And as a result, this is the condition that we find ourselves as a human race, okay? It means that the school systems and societies around the world have failed to properly educate and equip their students and inhabitants with the skills necessary to know how much food they are consuming, okay? Schools have failed to teach the basic skill of food measuring to their students. And as a result of that, because the world population is not equipped over the last 50 years to handle this new world, as a result, obesity and death related to being overweight has come to epidemic proportions. And so just add this to the long list of reasons that we already know that the traditional school system has completely failed and the traditional society norms have completely failed as well. Now, after going through this grim and dark, section of this introduction, the obvious next question that you might have is, where's the hope, right? What are the skills that the world needs in order to actually regulate how much they are eating, right? How can the residents of the world actually measure and keep track of the food that they are eating every single day? Well, here's the good news. Here at Remote Wellness Academy, we're really going to go ahead and answer all of this for you, so that way you are an educated and informed citizen of society. Because here's the truth. Over the last 10 years, we as an academy have tested and been experimenting with all of the different ways to measure and track our food. And we have been experimenting and testing this both on ourselves as well as with the students in the real world. And what we have done is we have compiled all of that learning into the easiest and most simple system in regards to measuring and tracking food. And so what we are going to do in the first part of this training is we are going to break down what that easiest and most simple system looks like for measuring and tracking your food once and for all. How are we going to do that? This is where, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to go ahead and introduce you to the 5 levels of food measuring. And so if you remember, when we talked about metabolism, we also broke it down into 5 levels. And so what we're going to be doing here is that we're going to go ahead and break down how to measure and track your food also into 5 levels, okay? And so this is going to be the system that is going to allow you to understand how to measure and track your food. And then once we go ahead and actually talk about how much to eat, it's going to be very, very, very easy and simple for you to actually understand. And so this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in the first part of this training. Now, before we actually dive into talking about level 1 of food measuring, I want to go ahead and answer a couple quick questions. Food tracking versus food measuring, which one is the one that we're going to use? What's the difference between the two? For the sake of simplicity, going forward in this training, we are going to refer to food measuring and tracking as just food measuring, okay? But it is important to note that most of the time when we are talking about quote unquote food measuring, it's not only about measuring, it's also about tracking, because both of these concepts go hand in hand. What's the difference? Measuring is knowing how much to eat, and then one piece of that is tracking, okay? So most of the time when you are measuring and then all you do is you just write down what you measured, that's the tracking piece of all of this, okay? So simple, very, very easy. The other point I want to go ahead and address, a common question when we go ahead and dive into the levels of measuring, is why talk about this at different levels, right? Now, do you remember what our goal in module 3 of this program is, right? We talked about how obviously phase 1 is for you to get your remote wellness certification, so that way you have the value and the power to put into production once we actually go into the monetization, the income, and the business training, right? We talked about that at the overall, but then specifically within phase number 1, we said that in module number 3 is where we are equipping you with that massive toolbox of understanding for you to be able to transform your own health as well as the health of your students. And so the reason why it's so important for us to talk about this at different levels is so that way you can communicate different levels of food measuring depending on how advanced someone is and depending on how accurate you want to be with yourself in your own health transformation, as well as how accurate you want to be with your students' transformation as well. And so the truth is that by the end of this training, you will be able to communicate with a 5-year-old about what food measuring is and how they can do it, as well as a conversation with a nutritionist about what food measuring is and every level in between, okay? And so this is the value of speaking about food measuring at different levels, and this is the value of the remote wellness certification that you are going through right now, because you absolutely become an asset that is so extremely valuable to every level of person that you communicate with. It does not matter if that person is a child, and it does not matter if that person is an expert. You can help transform every single human being that you come across for the rest of your life based on what it is that you are learning inside of this program, okay? Another quick common question that it comes up at this time is, am I going to talk about this concept to my students in levels as well, okay? So a lot of times students hear, hey, levels of food measuring, and they go ahead and say, oh no, how in the world am I going to talk to my students about all of this exactly like this? It's too complex. So let me go ahead and make this very clear. You will not be speaking to your students about this concept in this way, especially not initially, right? Especially in the one-on-one format, before you get into the hybrid format, you're not going to be communicating and demonstrating this concept in this way, okay? Remember, the transformation track that you are going through inside of this program is because of the fact that you are getting your certification, okay? So unless your students are also getting a certification with RWA, they're going to have a different track, okay? And so the track that you are going to walk your students through, that is going to be what we talk about when we get to module number 5, okay? And so don't worry, when we get there is going to be when we provide for you all of the templates and the swipe files and the copy and paste and the plug and play programs, and all of what you are going through right now is going to be 100% licensable by you. You're going to have that license for you for the history and the time of your entire career. And so you're going to have completely everything effortless for you after you get your certification and start actually having your own students. And so those were just a few quick common questions that come up in the very beginning and the very introduction of food measuring. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into learning about the 5 levels of food measuring. Now, as we get into this, I do want to just go ahead and do a quick pulse check, right? You want to be like this dude right here who is our friend, who literally takes his office chair and travels the world and sees very scenic and amazing places, is that this is a good point in the training that if you do need a break, you can go ahead and do that. Obviously, if you need it, don't take breaks if you don't need it. But remember, hey, you can break this training up. There is no rush. You do not have to do this in one sitting. And all you got to do is, hey, maybe you got to sit back for a second, look away from the computer. If you want to kind of stand up, move around, feel free to do that. And so this is that pulse check just to let you know that, hey, before we dive into the 5 levels of understanding how to measure food, this is a good part in order to take a break if you need it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into level 1 of food measuring. So level 1 food measuring is what we call hunger and fullness scale. Okay, so the very first question is, well, what is a hunger and fullness scale? So food measuring using the hunger and fullness scale is when we create individual levels of hunger and fullness for ourselves in order to determine when we should start eating and when we should stop eating. And so basically what we're doing is we are measuring and tracking our food based on our own intuitive scale to determine when we should start and stop eating. Now, in terms of accuracy, when it comes to the hunger and fullness scale, obviously because we are trying to keep track of how much we are eating based on when we are hungry and full, this is not going to be something that is very accurate as a measurement, right? But remember, it's only level 1, okay? And because this entire process is not very tangible, that is the reason why, right? Like hunger and fullness is not really a tangible concept that we can actually put a number to, right? It's very difficult to put a number to it. We're going to try and put a number to it when we get to the activity for this specific level. But the benefit, truthfully, of this level, even though it's not that accurate, is that it really is a great place for beginners to get started because it's not that difficult and it really cultivates that foundation of being mindful and really stop eating when we are full, right? A lot of times, because so many people have been living in modern day society and they've been sleepwalking through not only their life, but also their relationship with food, a lot of times people will go ahead and eat far in excess of the fact that, hey, I was full 30 minutes ago, but I'm still eating. And so this this level really cultivates that foundation of that intuitive and more mindful eating. And so for most people in society who have basically been unconsciously eating and they've literally never tracked their food ever before, even just this level 1 of food measuring is going to create amazing results in their life because of the fact that they're starting to become conscious, even if that is only getting conscious on when they are hungry and when they are full. Now, the other end of this spectrum is when we talk about the problem with the hunger and fullness scale, because the truth is that most people actually don't realize there is a difference between hunger and appetite. And this might even be the first time that as you're listening to this training, as you're going through this training, this might be the first time that you are recognizing that there is a difference between hunger and appetite. Because here's the thing, if you haven't eaten all day long and you're still not hungry, right? It might happen for many reasons like stress or excitement or you were busy, right? That does not mean that your body doesn't need the food, okay? This doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat. It just means that you don't have the appetite for food, but the hunger, the need of your body to eat is still there, right? Your body still needs the calories and the energy, okay? And so in this case, you actually would have to almost force yourself to eat if you haven't eaten all day, for example. And then when the body senses that it is being given food, then naturally you start to develop that appetite because you're actually starting the process of eating. Now remember, I am not condoning forcing yourself to eat. I'm just showing you the example that if somebody hasn't eaten all day long, then there's going to come a point where if they're still not hungry, they are going to have to almost start that process of eating, even if they're not hungry, in order for that appetite to build, okay? And so this is extremely common for people who are used to white knuckling their way through diets, right? They really get used to killing their appetite, right? And if you remember what we talked about when we spoke about metabolism, we talked about that just like a real fire, we actually have to feed that metabolism with logs, with fuel. Otherwise, that fire starts to get smaller, right? And so we have to make sure that we can continuously add fuel to that fire in order to keep it running. And so this is why sometimes level 1 food measuring can be a problem for some people who don't recognize that there is a difference between hunger and appetite. But at the end of the day, we really just use level 1 for beginners, and it really is extremely useful for beginners as well. Now, the other question that might come up is, okay, well, what's the solution to making sure that I am eating enough, even if I'm not hungry, based off of the hunger and fullness scale, right? Because if this entire level 1 is based off of hunger and fullness, well, what if I'm not hungry, right? How do I make sure that I can still start the process of eating? And the solution to that is what we call a food diary. The solution to that is what we call a food diary. And that's exactly what I want to go ahead and talk to you right now, because this is the part when we talk about a food diary where food tracking comes into place, okay? Because especially at these lower levels of measuring food where it's less accurate, it actually becomes even more important to keep track of the food that we are eating via a food diary. Because if we only rely on when we are hungry for us to eat, yes, it's going to be amazing for a lot of people who are used to overeating. However, for people who are used to undereating, it may not be the best approach because they might not have an appetite. And so a food diet really solves that problem. And the reason it solves that problem is because the truth is that the research and the data and the science is very clear about this. Humans are terrible at remembering things. Literally, humans, 1 hour after they remember something, after they need to remember something, they forget 50% of what they just learned. After 24 hours, they forget 70% of what it is that they just learned. And then a week later, they've forgotten 90% of what it is that they've learned, okay? Human beings are just like that. We are terrible at this, okay? And so if we rely too much on intuitive eating without actually having a food diary, then it can actually become very difficult for us to have an idea of how much we ate because of the fact that we're not tracking it. And so the chances that we overeat above our caloric intake is significant if we don't pair up level 1 with a food diary. And the chances that we significantly undereat aka too much of a caloric deficit, is also significant when we don't pair up these lower levels of accuracy food measuring with some sort of food tracking diary, okay? And so in the end, how you are going to change an outcome is going to be correlated to you being able to have a record of the input that you had, okay? Now, how do you actually keep a food diary for level 1? Well, there are many ways, okay? Some people like to be able to write it down on a note in their phone. Some people prefer to write it down on a notebook in their kitchen. Ultimately, the preference is completely up to you. However, keeping a food diary at this level of food measuring is absolutely essential, okay? All you really got to do is you just write down, hey, this was the meal. This was how hungry I was when I ate. And this is how full I was when I ate, maybe the approximate time that I ate as well, okay? And so really, this is why a food diary is very important for this level of food measuring. Now, did you really think that we were going to leave you with just some theoretical idea of how to track hunger and fullness, and we're not going to help you practice this? Of course not. And so this is why I want to go ahead and now talk to you about the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity. Okay, so in this activity, what we are going to do is we're going to actually practice this level of food measuring. Okay, because this level of food measuring is actually critical for you and your students to learn. Like we talked about, it really makes the foundation of intuitive and mindful eating. Now, before we get into the actual mini training that is going to be talking about this activity, I want to go ahead and I would urge you not to skip this or do this in a lazy manner for yourself. Because remember, this entire remote wellness certification is your opportunity to be a student in the program and in terms of the health transformation aspect, okay? And so if you are lazy with these activities, there are 2 things that are going to happen. Number 1, which is most important, you yourself will never learn how to do this. And so when it comes time for you to recommend this to your students, you are going to struggle speaking from experience because you yourself have never done it. And then on top of that, you can never comment on your own struggles. You can never relate to this exercise. You can never relate to the student. And that is ultimately going to impact your income in the future. Okay, that's number 1. That's the first thing that's going to happen. It's a very most important thing. Okay, the second thing is that when we go back and evaluate your participation for the eligibility for your certification, we're going to notice, hey, this student really didn't do this activity properly. We're going to have them go back and do this exercise. Now, is that the reason why you should do it? I hate it when traditional schools are like, hey, you have to do this because of the grade, or you got to do this because of the degree and all that kind of stuff. No, at the end of the day, the certification is just an added perk, because truthfully, the thing that you should care about, the thing that is most important for you is number 1, it is your experience. Because if you have to fake your experience for your students, I promise you it is going to impact your ability to earn an income in the future. And that is ultimately why you should care about this, okay? The certification is just the added perk. That is just the additional thing. But ultimately, what you need to care about is the experience that you have and its impact on your income, okay? Now, to make this easier for you, the exception that we are going to be making for this activity specifically is that even though this activity is called the 6-day activity, because you are actually going to have 2 activities that you are going to be doing inside of this training. The second one we're going to talk about here in a little bit. What we're going to do is we're actually going to shorten this activity from the normal 6 days, and you are actually instead going to do this activity for 2 days, okay? And remember, this is only for the hunger and fullness scale activity, okay? So don't apply this and be like, oh, all of the 6-day activities, I'm just going to make them 2 days. No, we're only making this exception for this activity because of the fact that you are going to have 2 of them, all right? So without further ado, let's go ahead and cut over to the mini training that is going to walk you through the instructions for the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity. All right, welcome to this quick mini training about the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity. Just as a reminder, just like all of the activities inside of the program and all of the templates and worksheets that we provide for you, make sure you go ahead and click on File, make a copy, and make your own copy and store it inside of your Google Drive. And so the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity is going to have a total of 3 pages. So the first page I'm going to walk you through is the instructions page. The second page is going to be part 1, which is the 3-day observation, okay? And then the third page is going to be part 2, which is the 3-day experiment, okay? So let's go ahead and walk through this entire part. So we're going to go over the instructions for part 1 first. And in part 1, what we are going to do, just like similar to other 6-day activities, we're going to go ahead and do a 3-day observation, okay? So On this part, we're not going to make any changes to our current hunger and fullness scale during this 3-day observation. And all we're going to do is we're just going to notice when we start eating and when we stop eating. Okay, so we're really just going to start to notice this. And then what we're going to do is on the worksheet below, for the first 3 days, we are going to mark how hungry we were when we started eating and how full we were when we stopped eating. Okay, and so then what we're going to do is really kind of just create a general scale of 1 to 10. Okay, so 1, just noticing hunger, 10 is like starving, right? And then you kind of just attaching how you feel to that scale. Okay, and this is going to be different for everyone. And then we're going to create a general fullness scale. Okay, and so we're going to say, okay, cool, 10 is just stuffed and 1 is starving. Again, attaching how you feel. This is going to be different for everyone, okay? And then as we are going through this, we're going to add a little bit of nutrition how to this, and we're going to notice who we are being when we are eating. And we're going to ask ourselves questions like, hey, do you eat when you're actually not hungry? Do you eat out of boredom, anger, stress, or depression? Do you eat mainly for energy and or pleasure? Again, you're just kind of observing these things, right? As you're going through the first 3 days of this activity. And then slowly you're going to start to begin to recognize, okay, when am I going to actually start to become hungry? What are the signs of what that looks like? And then step 7 on here, or instruction 7, right? The main goal for the first 3 days is to really just observe your current habits. So that way in the second half of this activity, you're able to really start creating new habits around honoring your hunger and your fullness. Okay. Now, for the purposes of your certification and for the purposes of the main training, we've already spoken about how you're going to be doing this activity in 2 days. And so because of that, this portion right here, this first part, is actually just going to happen over the course of 1 day for you for the purposes of the certification. However, and this is a big however, if you would like, and because of how powerful this activity is, and if you feel like there's a lot of value in this activity for you in getting the full experience for your students, feel free absolutely to go ahead and do this 6-day activity for the full 6 days. You do not have to stop after 1 or 2 days. You can go ahead and do the entire 6 days completely up to you. Okay, so that is part 1 and how you're going to be doing the observation section for this activity. And then we are now going to then have part number 2. Before I go into part 2, let me show you what the worksheet for part number 1 looks like. And so what we are doing here for part number 1 observation, we're writing the date over here. Let's say, 5/21/2023, for example, hypothetically, whatever date it is. And then we say, cool, breakfast, right? I went ahead and ate breakfast, and I'm going to notice, when I started eating breakfast, how hungry was I when I started eating, right? Maybe in the morning, I was very hungry. So as a result, I was like a 10 on the hunger scale, right? And then how full was I when I stopped eating? Honestly, I didn't have a very big breakfast, so it was like a 3. I wasn't that full, right? And then you're just going to notice some observation. You're going to write down, you know what? What are the observations that you noticed there? Okay. Then lunch, how hungry was I? I was pretty hungry because of the fact that I had a light breakfast, but then when I stopped eating, I was like a 9. Right? I was super stuffed. And then write down some of the observations that you had there, right? At dinner, I wasn't really that hungry. And I ate and, I was like a 4, and then I just stuffed myself. Now, here's the other point about this. You can take this worksheet, and because it's completely editable by you, if you wanted to have like snacks in here, if you wanted to add like, snack 1, snack 2, snack 3, you can change this table. It's 100% editable. And so you can even change, instead of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you can have meal 1, meal 2, meal 3, meal 4, whatever. You can add another row in this. So again, remember, tailor this towards your approach. Take initiative as a student for what is going to be appropriate for you to get the best experience out of this. Okay, so this is part 1. Observation, 3 days for the full activity. In your case, if you're only doing the shortcutted version, then it's 1 day. However, again, remember, if you want to do the full 3 days for observation, completely feel free to do so, because this activity is extremely valuable, especially as you're going through and observing, hey, when am I eating when I'm not hungry? When am I eating when I'm depressed, when I'm stressed, when I'm bored, all that kind of stuff. Extremely powerful. And then for part number 2, it's now time to actually change things, right? We're going to experiment. And in the second 3 days, we're going to start to experiment and making changes to our hunger and fullness scale. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're now going to create a new intuitive hunger and fullness scale based off of the 3 days of data that we had from the observation. And so what we're now going to do is we're actually going to pick, okay, you know what? This is the number that indicates on this scale when it's time for me to eat. And this is the number on the scale when it indicates time for me to stop eating. Okay, so even though we had created these general scales, right, this was just a general, like, hey, I'm super, super hungry versus I'm super starving versus, hey, I'm stuffed versus I'm starving, right? So we had these general scales, but now over here, we're actually picking, okay, you know what? For me, my body type, based off my preferences, based off how my mind works, I need to make sure that when I hit a 3 on this scale of hunger, I better go and get some food immediately. Because if I get down to a 1, that's when I start binging. I don't care what I eat, and it's terrible. And then for me, based on my body type, based off my preferences, based off of how I function, for me, I got to stop eating when I'm at like a 7 or 8. And that's where you're starting to attach these feelings to that scale number, right? It's not the weight scale, not the food scale. What we're talking about is the self-hunger and fullness scale, okay? So it's an intuitive sense that you're getting from this. And then thirdly, here on the experiment part, here are some 6 ways, just some notes and tips that we've gone ahead and put in terms of how you can honor hunger and fullness, right? So number 1, start planning and preparing the meals when you get to around a level 2. If that is the level that you went ahead and picked over here. If it's not, you can change it and you can really start preparing maybe at a 3, maybe at a 4. You're like, you know what? I don't want to go below a 4. And so you start preparing at that time, right? Eating energy and eating high energy foods based off of what your body wants. When eating, aim for about an 8 on your fullness scale, right? You make sure that you're really getting the energy that you need to be nourished, but also not feeling stuffed. Again, if you went ahead and changed this up here, however, 2 and 8 are typically some good indicators there, okay? Number 4, this is a very good tip. What you do is you actually make a physical gesture when your meal is complete by really just pushing your plate away or maybe putting a napkin over it or whatever that might be, and then declaring out loud, I'm full, right? And so you do the gesture and you declare out loud, and so it kind of becomes like this inbred habit forming, right? You do this habit instantly and automatically. Once you hit that level 8 on the fullness scale, boom, push the plate away, say, I'm full. That's it. And the more you do that, it starts to become ingrained in terms of a habit. So that way, when you hit that 8, you're not feeling more and more tempted to eat. Remember, these are not skills that our ancestors ever had to learn. They never had an issue where they had so much food. And so that's why we're training ourselves to have some of these different habits. So that way we can actually properly honor our hunger and fullness, okay? And then step number 6, if you're eating out, right, when you reach your fullness and level scale, you can actually go ahead and ask for the rest of your meal to be packed so that way you can take it. This was something that took me a very long time to realize that, like, man, you know, when we're growing up, we have these beliefs that our parents tell us, hey, you have to finish your food, you have to finish your food, you have to finish your food. And so what that means is that a lot of times, some of us will go past the fullness level, even if we're not comfortable, even we're starting to feel bad about it, even we're really not like, we're like sick to our stomach, and we're still forcing ourselves to eat. Why is that the case? Because of those inbred kind of ingrained beliefs that we had from childhood. But the truth is, especially when we're eating out, literally, you don't have to eat past the fullness level. You literally just go ahead and ask, hey, I want to have the rest of this pack to go. And so there's no reason why you have to stuff yourself. Absolutely no reason you have to do that. And so this is a very, very, very amazing tip that is extremely powerful for you to go ahead and utilize as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what the worksheet looks like for the experiment portion of this. Exactly the same way as we talk about the observation. However, we have right here an additional column. And this additional column says, did I prepare my meal at hunger level 2? Okay, and so we're going to just go ahead and circle. At breakfast, did I prepare my meal at hunger level 2? Yes or no? And so as you start to do this, you'll start to get an idea of, remember, what gets measured gets managed. You'll start to get an idea of whether or not you are building the habit of preparing your meal, or at least packaging your meal, or maybe you've meal prepped and you've taken it out and you're at work or whatever, that you're at least, getting it out of the lunchbox. You're starting the process of getting that food ready, regardless of if you're at home or out or whatever, when you hit that level 2 hunger. And then same thing over here. How hungry were you when you started eating? And then how full were you when you stopped eating? You want to go ahead and make those changes based off of the tips that we talked about above, and then really start to be able to change on this and make sure you can compare part 1 and part 2. And ideally, if you're doing proper changes and you're experimenting, you're kind of getting better, you should start to see a lot of these numbers even out a lot more compared to the observation. And so this is ultimately what this 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity looks like. Remember, again, don't do this lazily. It's very important for you to do it properly. And if you feel that this is extremely valuable, which in my opinion, it is extremely valuable, I would recommend, hey, Do it for the full 6 days. Maybe you don't do it immediately, but maybe after you finish the other activity inside of this training, you come back to this as well. It is a very, very powerful tool for the rest of your life. You have those numbers. Hey, I eat at around a 2 and I stop eating at around an 8, right? The issue is not learning the numbers. That's not what we're talking about here. The issue is not learning the numbers. The issue is associating what those numbers mean to how you feel. And that's why the experience is so absolutely critical for you to go through, so that way you can feel in your specific body, what does it feel like to be a level 2 hunger? That's not something you can read a book about. That's not something that I can talk to you about. You need to learn and feel that yourself by actually going through the experience. Same thing. What does it feel like in your body to actually experience a fullness level of 8? The only way you're going to get intuitive around that feeling at around a 2 and an 8 is if you actually experience it yourself. Okay, so this is why my recommendation is to definitely come back and do this. If not, you can do it immediately right now, do the full 6 days, or you can come back and do this at a later time as well. Okay, beautiful. Let's go ahead and hop back over to the main training. All right, welcome back from that quick mini training about the 6-day hunger and fullness scale. Remember, it's going to be very important for you to do that properly. Don't do it lazily. You want to make sure that you do it properly so that way you can get the full experience, okay? Now, as we start to close out level 1 understanding of food measuring, the reason why it's important to understand level 1 of food measuring is because level 1 really is the foundation upon which you understand your body, and it really is a very important step to walk yourself through, as well as when you have your own transformation program, it's going to be very important for you to utilize for your students as well. Okay, so even though it is the least accurate way to measure food, hunger and fullness scales are still exponentially better than what most people do. And what most people do is they just default to their human patterns of, hey, when food is available, it's time to feast, right? And so remember, because our ancestors never had unlimited food like we do today, this is why this is a new skill that we need to learn, even though it's never a skill that our ancestors had, okay? And unfortunately, this is one of the basic skill sets that school and society has failed to teach everyone around us. And that is why 74% of adults in the United States are overweight, okay? And so this is the importance of level 1 food measuring. And so just remember, every level that we go deeper and deeper and deeper, our understanding of food measuring is going to go up, as well as how accurate we get in the amount of energy that we eat is also going to go up as well. Okay, so that is level 1 of the energy that we eat, food measuring, which is the hunger and fullness scale. Beautiful. Let's go ahead and now jump into level 2. So again, you're doing phenomenal. Remember, we got 5 levels. We're 1 down. We got 4 left to go. Level 2 measuring food is what we call hand measuring level of food measuring. Okay. Now, the very first question you might have is, what is hand measuring food measuring, right? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. We use our hands in order to determine the amount of food that we should eat. And the beautiful thing about this is that wherever we go, our hands will be with us. And so it makes a lot of sense to use our hands as a guide for estimating the amount of food that we are eating. And so hand measuring works well for many reasons. Number 1, the hands are portable, right? They come with you to lunches and restaurants and social gatherings and even grandma's house, right? And then the second reason is that hands are consistent in size, right? Hands typically don't change size overnight. And so they're very consistent in a portion reference, right? And then number 3, hands are proportional to the individual, because typically bigger people need more food, and typically bigger people have bigger hands. And then in the same way, typically smaller people need less food, and smaller people also have smaller hands. Now, if you're one of those people that is very big and has tiny hands, might be a problem. And if you're one of those people who is very, very small and has massive hands, I'm joking. I don't know if that's even a thing. But regardless, this is the point, which is that hands are proportional to the size of the individual. Now, the other quick thing to know about the way that we use hand measuring is that there are 2 ways to utilize hand measuring. The very first way that we can utilize hand measuring is really to go ahead and measure the sizes of all foods, regardless of the type of food that it is. So for example, we might use the entire size of the thumb and approximate that to about 1 ounce of food, okay? And so what we'll do in the first way of measuring food with our hands is that regardless of if the food that we are measuring is a protein or a fat or whatever, we'll say, you know what, entire size of the thumb, that is 1 ounce, okay? And so that's the first way that we can utilize measuring food with our hands. And so in the same way, we talk about a fist, we talk about a thumb, we talk about the tip of the thumb, we talk about the index finger, we talk about the cupped palm, we talk about the flat size of the palm, right? All of those have specific measurements that would go along with it. So this is the first way that we can utilize our hands in order to measure food, regardless of what type of food it is. The second way that we can use our hands in order to measure food is when we want to go ahead and say, you know what, instead of measuring the same for all types of food, I'm going to delineate and I'm going to differentiate between the types of food, aka between the types of macronutrients. And so in this type of hand measuring, what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what, a portion of protein is going to be a palm, a portion of vegetables is going to be a fist, a portion of carbs is going to be one cupped hand, and then a portion of fat is going to be 1 thumb. And so what we're doing here is we're differentiating between the macronutrient and the type of sizing that we're going to use with our hands. And so we can say, you know what, 1 cupped hand is going to be approximately 20 to 30 grams of this macronutrient, right? And this is a conventional measurement. If we were measuring kind of foods, this is what that would look like. And then 1 palm of protein is going to be between 20 and 30 grams of protein. And that might be something like this right here, right? And then fats, 1 thumb is going to be approximately 7 to 12 grams of fats. And that's going to be approximately 1 tablespoon, okay? And so those are the 2 ways in which we can actually utilize our hands, regardless of the food it is, or specific to the macronutrient as well. Now, in terms of accuracy, when we talk about accuracy when it comes to hand measuring, as you can see, as we are starting to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the levels of food measuring, we are getting more and more accurate. However, measuring your food with your hands can only be so accurate, right? And so obviously the range of accuracy, although it's more than level 1, it's still nowhere near as accurate as we are going to see in some of the more higher levels of food tracking. However, there is still a benefit to this because the second level of food measuring is great for beginners because they're just starting out. It's not that difficult, but it's still more accurate than level 1, right? And so for most people who are just getting used to, hey, you know, I've been unconsciously eating my entire life, I just learned about the hunger and food scale, for them, even just by utilizing this second level of food measuring, they're still going to get amazing, phenomenal results in their body composition. But with that being said, just like we talked about in level 1, it's still very important to have an accompanying food diary with level 2. And this is really where that tracking piece comes in, especially at these lower levels of measuring food where it's less accurate. It becomes even more important to keep track of the food via a food diary, right? Why? Because just like we talked about, humans are terrible, absolutely horrendous at actually remembering things. And so that's why a food diary is very, very important, okay? And so without tracking the food in a food diary, we have no idea how much we ate. We might overeat, we might undereat. And so even with level 2 of food measuring and food tracking, it's very important for us to have that accompanying food diary, okay? So how to keep a food diary for level 2? Again, this is all just tools. It doesn't matter what is better or worse. It's just whatever works for that individual. And so it might just be as simple as writing down, hey, you know, what meal it is. And then, hey, I ate 1.5 palm size of chicken. So that way they have a track record. And then if they want to lose weight, well, guess what? They know I've been eating 1.5 palms of this chicken for the last, week. And all I got to do is just eat less than that palm size in the future. And I'm going to lose weight. If I want to gain weight, I would just increase that, right? Rice, 2 cups of hands, 2 cupped hands. And so in that way, when you have that log, at least you have some sort of tracking behind that. Now, here is a quick ninja tip for you. When eating out at social gatherings for level 2 of food measuring, you can actually take a photo with your hand beside the meal. And so that way you can actually estimate the amount of food that you ate later on if you don't actually want to have to calculate it in that moment. Otherwise, you might be like, oh, I'm out with friends, I'm out with family. It's that social experience. I kind of feel weird trying to have to do all these calculations right now. You can just take a photo of it with the hand next to the meal, and then you can always calculate it and put it in your food diary later on. Now, what about an activity for level 2 food measuring. So although we're not going to be having a activity to practice this level of food measuring, I do want to go ahead and emphasize that it is still very important for you to understand. And the reason that's important is because if you understand it, in the future, you can choose to go ahead and practice this on your own as well. But for the sake of the certification, we did not see it as important for you to have to practice as some of the other levels that we're going to talk about. But I just want to go ahead and let you know that, hey, you understand it, you can implement it. So that way later on in the future, if you need to implement it for yourself as you're going through that experience with your students, you can do so as well. And so ultimately, why do I need to learn level 2 of food measuring? The reason why it's important, because of the fact that level 2 is that stepping stone of those skills, depending on how advanced the student is. It's going to be very important for yourself as well as for your students in the future to be able to understand level 2 of food measuring. And remember, it's really that awesome next step after level 1 food tracking. Okay, so even though it's not as accurate as what it is that we are going to be talking about in the upcoming levels, it is still exponentially better than what most people are doing. And so remember, at the end of the day, yes, our ancestors never had unlimited food. And so yes, that is exactly why we have to learn these skill sets that are different from our ancestors. Okay, and so this is why it's important to learn level 2 of food measuring. And remember, every single level that we go deeper, the more and more accurate we are going to get. And so that is level 2 of food measuring, and that is what we talked about, which was hand measuring. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop over next to the food measuring level 3. So again, you are doing phenomenal. We are now 2 out of 5 done. Let's keep on chugging through this. Stick with me here. Level 3 is what we call the portion plate level of food measuring. So what is the portion plate level of food measuring? So portion plate level of food measuring is when we use something called a portion plate in order to divide up our plate into different portions, so that way we can determine how much food that we should eat. Now, there are 2 versions of the portion plate depending on the goals and how advanced the student is. Okay, so there's version 1 and then there is version 2. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through both of these really quickly right now. Okay, so portion plate number 1, this is what it looks like. And what it is it's for somebody who is transitioning from the typical American diet to a more active lifestyle. And it's meant to be much easier for them to be able to divide up their plate. So you can imagine you have a plate right here, okay? And then it's very easy because you just say, cool, 1/3 of my plate is going to be green vegetables. 1/3 of my plate is going to be high quality protein. 1/3 of my plate is going to be nutrient dense, starchy vegetables or grains. And then I'm just going to have 1 to 3 tablespoons of high quality fats there, okay? Now, version number 1 of the portion plate is a very good starting point because it's very easy. There's very few measurements. Yes, we're measuring, 1 to 3 tablespoons on here. But other than that, we're just looking at the plate and then dividing our plate up. Very easy. And then as the student starts to get used to portion plate number 1, then we move on to portion plate number 2. And portion plate number 2 is a little bit more advanced because what we're doing now is we're saying, cool, you know what? 1/2 to 1 cup of protein is going to be on our plate. We're going to have 2 cups of vegetables. We're going to have 1/2 to 1 cup of complex carbs, and we're going to have 1 to 2 tablespoons of a healthy fat. Okay. And so what we're doing is we're just kind of bumping up the measurement here. And so it's not just about splitting the plate up, it's also about the cups that are going on the plate. And so that is what portion plate 2.0 looks like. So what I want to do really quickly is I want to talk to you about what does it look like for a real world example in regards to the portion plate transition. Okay, so typically this is just a kind of an example I want to go ahead and give you is, let's say for example, before the portion plate, the student says, you know what, I really need to drink Diet Coke. I really like Diet Coke. I want to drink Diet Coke. Okay, now instead of telling them, hey, stop, you shouldn't drink Diet Coke, it's not the best for you, right? Instead of saying that, we can recognize that, you know what? Drinking Diet Coke is something that some people do, right? And so what you always want to remember is that when it comes to making changes for a student, what we always need to do is we need to meet the student where they are at. And so the important thing to remember is that the more change that someone needs, the less they can actually handle, okay? And so if they are going to be drinking a Diet Coke, right, we know that from the what to eat training, that artificial sweeteners are really going to trigger that blood sugar roller coaster, right? And so a lot of people, when they say, cool, I'm going to transition to eating healthier, they say, you know what, I'm still going to drink my Diet Coke, but you know what, I want to be healthy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to eat a salad with my Diet Coke, right? And then what ends up happening is that because of the fact that there is no nutritional content that is substantial inside of that salad, they end up becoming starving later on in the day, and then they end up binging on some other food, right? And so when they drink that Diet Coke with the salad, there is nothing in their system to help them balance out that sweetener that they have drank with the Diet Coke, and so they feel worse as a result of the blood sugar roller coaster, right? And so instead, when we are transitioning over to the portion plate level of this, right, if the student is at that level, so then instead we say, you know what, instead of having a salad, what we're going to do instead is we're going to try the portion plate. And so instead of having a salad, we're going to actually have a high quality protein on there with your Diet Coke. We're going to have a high quality fat on there as well. And so what might that look like in practice is it might look like a bowl of chili with some cheese, because that protein and that fat is going to help offset the effects of the blood sugar roller coaster. And so the student feels so much better. And so we tell the student, hey, we're going to try this for 6-7 days and we're going to see how we feel. And we're just going to experiment, and there is no pressure to that. And so this is what it looks like in terms of a real world example of utilizing that transition to the portion plate level of food measuring. And so as you can see, the portion plate is not something that is literal. It can be literal, right? It can literally be, hey, this is exactly what it's going to look like on your plate. But it really is just about filling in the different types of foods inside of the meal, so that way we can have a more balanced meal according to these ratios of macronutrients to help mitigate the effects that would happen as a result of the blood sugar roller coaster, as well as giving us a pulse on how much we are eating, okay? So you can kind of see how all of this is working together. Now, in terms of accuracy, and when it comes to the portion plate, although it is still not as accurate as some of the more advanced levels that we are going to speak about here in a second, it is still significantly more accurate than levels 1 and 2 in its accuracy, right? And because of the fact that there are two versions of the portion plate, we can actually, within this level itself, move the student up to measuring cups of food as they get more advanced within this level. And then in the same way that we spoke about in some of the previous other levels, we talked about the food diary. And so just like that, it's going to be also very important for us to be tracking inside of level 3 as well. Why? Because as I've said over and over and over again, humans are terrible at remembering things. It's just a fact. And so as a result, we want to make sure that we have that food diary to keep track of what's going on. And so in regards to the food diary for level 3, let's say portion plate number 1, we can usually just kind of take a picture of the plate and then evaluate what percentage that we were actually having with the macronutrients. And then for portion plate 2.0, we can just keep track of the number of cups for the type of food that we were eating, right? And so the same tip that we utilized in level 2 also applies here in level 3, in which we can take a photo of our plate if we're using level 3 portion plate 1.0, and then later on we can estimate, okay, you know what, 50% of my plate was this, 25% of my plate was this, and we can start to be able to get that diary data later on if necessary. Now, what about an actual activity for level 3 food measuring? So for this level, we're not going to have an activity inside of your certification. However, I do want to go ahead and emphasize that it is still very important for you to understand. So that way, if you choose to practice this on your own in the future, you can do so, okay? But for the sake of the certification, we did not see this level as important as some of the other levels that we are going to be talking about. And so that for that reason, there is no activity for level 3 food tracking, okay? But ultimately, it is still very important to learn level 3 food measuring, okay? And the reason for that is because you can start to see these are kind of like stepping stones. As you are going through your own transformation, as well as the transformation for your students, each of these levels is very important to understand. And then for most people who are just unconsciously eating, each of these levels is going to be exponentially better than what they are doing for their default human programming, which is, when food is available, I feast until I cannot even breathe anymore. that obviously is going to be significantly less efficient and effective than even level 1, level 2, or level 3 of food measuring, okay? So remember, because our ancestors didn't have unlimited food, we have to learn these new skill sets, and this is why we are talking about what it is that we are talking about, okay? So this is why it's important to learn level 3 of food measuring, and then every single level, as we are going deeper and deeper and deeper, we are getting more and more accurate in the food measuring, okay? So this has been level 3 of food measuring, which is the portion plate. Next up, we're going to go ahead and dive directly into level 4 food measuring. Again, you are doing a phenomenal job. Stick with me here. We're gone ahead and finished 3 of the 5, so only 2 more left. Let's go ahead and talk about level 4 of food measuring, which is what we call scale measuring, okay? So what is level 4 for food measuring? It's called scale measuring, okay? Now, scale measuring is when we use a food scale to measure exactly the amount of food that we are eating, okay? And the beautiful thing about this is that it's at this level where we get a massive bump in the level of accuracy that we are measuring our food, because we are now putting a specific number that is attached to the food that we are eating, okay? And so scale measuring really is a critical piece of the food measuring levels, because it is at this level in which you and the student learns the skills of how to actually use a food scale, okay? So this is what a food scale looks like. And a food scale is different than a weight scale, okay? A weight scale is something that you weigh yourself on. It typically counts the amount of weight in pounds. However, a food scale is used for food specifically, and it actually has smaller measurements, okay? Now, what I want you to know about this is that it's at this level where you are going to learn the skill of how to use a food scale. And so, yes, that does mean that learning to use a food scale without thinking is a skill, okay? And just like all skills, perfect practice makes perfect, okay? And so the more you use it, the easier and more effortless it becomes. For me personally, it has literally become unconscious for me when I go ahead and actually get my food and I actually make my lunch and my dinner XYZ, right? I literally take my plate, I put it on the food scale that is sitting on my kitchen counter, and then I put the food on the plate. I do it without even thinking. I do it unconsciously. And so I measure all of my portions so easily. It literally, like, instead of putting the plate on the counter and then putting the food on it, you literally just put the plate on the food scale and then put the food on it. It's as simple as that, okay? I literally do not know how I would be able to measure my portion sizes in today's world without a food scale. This is how valuable this level of food measuring is. Now, let's talk about a couple factors when it comes to using level 4 food tracking, because there are 2 very important factors that you need to keep in mind if you are going to properly master this level of food measuring, okay? The very first factor is the type of food, which I'm going to talk to you about here in a second. And then the second factor is the quantity or the weight of food, okay? So when we talk about the type of food, it's very important to realize that whether or not the food has been cooked, whether or not it is uncooked, whether or not it's going to come in a package, it's very important to understand that, okay? What do we mean by this? What we mean is that sometimes some foods are already weighted in single servings. And so in that case, obviously you wouldn't need a food scale because the food has already been measured, right? And so when you do your food diary, when you do your food tracking, you can literally just write down the amount of food that was inside of that package, right? So for example, if you're eating, let's say, a bag of Doritos, well, there's no reason for you to take the bag of Doritos and then literally put it on the food scale and then measure every single chip. That doesn't make sense because you know that you are going to be eating the entire bag of Doritos. Now, if you're not going to be eating the entire bag, then you might have to do something like that where you kind of portion it out XYZ. But if you know that it's just a single serving, boom, just like that, then it's very easy for you and you don't actually have to write it down. But it's very different to differentiate the type of food when it comes to cooked, uncooked, frozen, and thawed food. Why is that important? The reason why it's important is because, let's say, for example, one day you measure your rice on the food scale uncooked, and then the next day you decide to measure your food on the food scale as cooked. Well, guess what? You are going to get 2 completely different amounts of food. And so you must consider this first point, this first factor, which is the type of food that you are putting on the food scale. And so this is what it looks like visually, because 40 grams of uncooked rice actually, once the water gets absorbed in the cooking process, is going to be something like 114 grams of cooked rice, right? Same thing. This is white rice, might be different for brown rice. And so not all foods are going to be the same, whether that be cooked, uncooked, white rice, brown rice, chicken breast versus chicken thigh. All of these are going to be different. And so this is a very important factor to consider when you are using the food scale. In the same way, pasta, 30 grams uncooked, 67 grams cooked, right? Bread, fresh bread versus 32 grams of toast bread, right? Frozen blueberries, once they get thawed out and that water is gone, they are going to be lighter. And so you want to make sure that you are being consistent in the way that you are using the food scale, so that way you can get consistent, accurate data in when you measure your food, okay? That is the first factor to consider when you are actually measuring your food using a food scale. The second factor that you want to consider is the actual quantity/weight of the food, okay? So the second factor to consider when using a food scale is specifically what unit of measurement you're going to be utilizing. So if one day you decide, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and measure my food in 10 grams of food, and then the next day you decide, you know what, I'm going to measure the food in 10 ounces of food, well, here's the truth. You're going to get two completely different quantities, and they're going to be wildly different. And so you must understand that the food scales measure in different units, okay? Typically, a food scale is going to measure in smaller increments, something like ounces and grams. Some of them also do like pounds and that kind of stuff, but typically ounces and grams is going to be your 2 units of measurement, okay? So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are consistent in what unit that you are measuring on the food scale. Now, the other question that you might ask is, hey coach, what's the difference between ounces and grams? And this is something that we sometimes learn in grade school, but this is another thing that schools do a terrible job of actually teaching properly. So we're going to go ahead and emphasize this again in adulthood, which is that the difference between ounces and grams has to do with the system of measurement that you choose to utilize. Okay, so here in the United States, we primarily use the US customary system, and then the rest of the world, don't get me started on this, uses the metric system, okay? Why? Because Americans, apparently we like to be different, okay? And so for length, in the US, we typically use inches, feet, yards, and miles. For weight and mass, we use ounces, pounds, and tons. For fluid capacity, we use fluid ounces, cups, pints, quarts, and gallons. And then the rest of the world uses this much more simpler system. And for length, they use meters. For weight, they use grams, and for liquid volume, they use liters. And the beautiful thing about the metric system is that all of the length, weight, and liquid volume is based off of those 3, right? So you have the milli, the centi, and the kilo, depending on what it is. So it's like, hey, millimeter, centimeter, meter, kilometer, milli, centi, gram, kilo, milliliter, centiliter, liter, kiloliter. It's an awesome system. Don't get me started. I don't know why. It's probably too difficult for the US to switch now. But regardless, in the United States, we primarily use the customary system, okay? But even though we use the customary system here in the United States, it is not uncommon for many people in the United States to actually use grams when weighing food because it's actually more accurate, okay? As you probably tell, I'm a fan of the metric system. So personally, I actually use grams when I measure my food on my food scale because I'm not a fan of ounces, okay? I'd rather have 155.9 grams of food rather than eat 5.5 ounces of food. Even though it's exactly the same, I think in my head, it just makes more sense and it's a little bit more accurate. However, what I want you to know is that there is no big difference between the two, okay? It's just an important factor to consider when using a food scale, so that way you can be consistent in what unit you are measuring. And then of course you can always kind of convert between the two. You just kind of Google, hey, how many grams, Google, are in 5 ounces? And then it's very easy for you to be able to convert, okay? So even though for the vast majority of things in the United States, we do use the customary system, there are a lot of people who actually prefer to use the food scale in grams. And then typically inside of food labels, a lot of things are in grams as well. So it just kind of makes it easier that way. But again, it does not matter what system or how you decide to do it. Just stick with whatever you are going to do, all right? Next thing I want to talk to you about inside of level 4 is I do want to go ahead and talk to you about how to use a food scale, because some students, when they first learn how to use a food scale, they start to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to have to put my plate on the scale, and then I'm going to have to go ahead and put my food on the plate, and then I'm going to have to subtract the weight of the food minus the weight of the plate, and then I'm going to go ahead and have to take out the food that I I put on the plate, and then I'm going to have to go ahead and put a different food on there and then subtract again and and all this stuff, okay? They make it very, very, very confusing for themselves. Here's the truth. You don't have to do any of that. There's no math or subtraction or any of that required. Why? Because you can use this amazing function that's called the tare function on the weight scale, on the food scale, in order to actually zero out the amount of food or the plate XYZ. So here's what that looks like visually, okay? So you have your food scale, and this is actually the exact same food scale that I have in my kitchen, so I'm very familiar with it, okay? What you do is you go ahead and put the plate on the food scale, and then the food scale is going to tell you, hey, this is 300 grams or whatever. And then all you do is you just hit the tare button, and the tare button is actually going to zero out the food scale. And so now you didn't even care about how much the plate weighed, because you're not going to eat the plate, right? And so it doesn't matter how much the plate weighs. And so you zero that out, and then you go ahead and let's say you put the chicken on the plate, and then cool, you know what? I ate 200 grams of chicken, right? And then you just write down 200 grams of chicken. Boom. No subtraction necessary. You didn't have to be like, okay, you know what? This was 300. This is 500. So now I got to do, 500 minus the weight of the plate and and then I get to 200 grams of chicken. You don't need any of that, okay? Boom, 200 grams of chicken. Very, very easy. Now, here's the cool part about this. You don't got to take the chicken off of the plate and then put some other food on it and then start the whole process over. All you do is you just hit that handy dandy tare button right there. Again, it's going to zero out the plate and the chicken this time around. And then you just go ahead and add your mashed potatoes. And now guess what? I ate 100 grams of mashed potatoes. You did not have to, 200 grams of chicken, and then I add the mashed potatoes. Now I got 300 grams on the plate, and now I got to subtract 300 grams minus the weight of the chicken. And then I find out that I have 100 grams of mashed potatoes. Nope. None of that necessary. Just use the dang handy dandy tare button, and all of it is going to be very, very simple for you. So I just wanted to go over that because in the past, students have been doing this crazy mathematical calculus thing where they've been calculating and then moving the food off the plate and doing all this stuff. Keep it simple for yourself. Use the tare button, and I just wanted to go ahead and talk to you about how to use the food scale there, okay? Now, in terms of accuracy, as you can imagine, scale measuring is massively more accurate than any of the other levels that we have spoken about thus far, right? However, I do want to go ahead and annotate that for you. I want to go ahead and make a side note here for you, is that even with the scale measuring, it is still not 1,000% accurate. Why? Because the chances of you being able to account for every single amount of food, it really isn't realistic, okay? So even though we are weighing as much as possible, even with scale measuring, we can assume that our approximation is still going to be about 10 to 20% off, okay? However, is this still the most accurate way to be able to measure our food compared to all of the other levels that we have spoken about? Absolutely. Now, in terms of when we talk about a food diary, this is where things get really fun here at level 4 because it gets very, very straightforward, right? Keeping a food diary at level 4 is very straightforward. All we got to do is we literally just write, hey, lunch, I had cooked chicken breast, 400 grams, right? Cooked brown rice, 150 grams. Or if you choose to do it in ounces, you do it in ounces, but make sure you're writing right what type of food it was, cooked, thawed, XYZ. That's going to be very important as well, okay? So again, just like all of the other levels, it is very important to keep some sort of food diary because humans suck at their memory. And so this is how you're able to do it, but it's very easy for you to be able to do it, okay? So ultimately, why do I need to learn level 4 of food measuring? The reason why is because it's one of the most accurate levels of food measuring and one of the most important as well, okay? And so it's literally as simple as putting your plate on the scale instead of putting it on the counter. That's it, okay? And so even though it is a little bit more advanced, it is absolutely an invaluable skill for you and your students to learn, okay? And then additionally, level 5 food measuring, which is what we're going to talk about next, is actually reliant on this level of food tracking, okay? And so you are going to have to master level 4 before you can get to mastering level 5, okay? And so ultimately, like I've said in every single one of these levels, the reason why we have to learn these new skills is because our ancestors didn't have unlimited food. And so our ancestors also didn't have food scales. And so as a result, we have to learn these different skill sets. And then that is ultimately why it's important to learn level 4 of food measuring. And remember, as you can see, as we go deeper and deeper and deeper on these levels, we are getting more and more accurate. Okay, so that has been level 4 of food measuring, which is scale measuring. Beautiful. Next up, we're going to go ahead and jump into level 5 of food measuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we have made it to the last level of food measuring, and the last level of food measuring is what we call app tracking. Okay, what is it called? It's called app tracking. So what is app tracking? App tracking is simply when we use the help of an app to track the amount of food that we have eaten. Okay, so level 5 app tracking is the highest level of measuring food and is the highest level of accuracy as well. Okay, it is at this level where we can know exactly how many calories that we have eaten. It is at this level where we know exactly how many grams of a macronutrient that we have eaten as well. Okay, now the very first question that you might have is, well, hey, Coach Yasin, how do we actually do level 5 food tracking, right? So when we are using app tracking, what that means is that we are actually going to have to use, in conjunction with the app, we are also going to have to use the food scale. So this is why I said just a little while ago, I said that we need to learn level 4 because we have to use both the app and the food scale together. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down step by step for you on how level 5 food tracking is done. Okay, so step number 1 for level 5 food tracking is downloading the food tracking app of your choice. Now, there are a gazillion different apps out there, okay? MyFitnessPal, Carbon Diet Coach, Lose It, Chronometer, Noom, just so many. There's so many out there, okay? Now, some people get lost in trying to figure out, hey, what's the best app that's out there for food tracking, right? It doesn't exist, because the truth is that these are just tools, and the tool is going to be based on the different preferences that everybody has, okay? Some of them are free, some of them are paid, and over the years, I myself, the staff here at RWA, we've literally tried so many different types. We are going to be making a recommendation here for the activity here in a little bit, okay? Personally, right now, I use a Carbon Diet Coach, but that's not the one we're going to actually recommend because it actually does cost $10 a month. But again, you don't have to run out and get some paid app, okay? We're going to actually be recommending for you a free one inside of the activity, so that way you can get started, and then if it is something that is suitable to your lifestyle, you can do it afterwards as well, okay? But bottom line, this is step number 1, is downloading the app of your choice, and do not get caught up in what app to use. Over time, as you and your students master the skill, you can literally choose whatever app you want, because ultimately what's important is the skill itself. And then after step number 1, what we're going to go ahead and do next is we're going to move on to step number 2. Now, step number 2 is going to be, once we actually have downloaded the app, we're going to go ahead and search the food that we are going to eat or that we have already eaten, or we can go ahead and scan the barcode as well, okay? Now, this is going to be where it's important to differentiate between cooked and uncooked. So if we are measuring our food and it's cooked, we want to make sure that we find the cooked version of that entry inside of the app. And then step 3 is we're going to enter the amount of food that we actually ate or that we are about to eat. And this is where using the food scale may be applicable, right? And so a couple things on here. For some foods, we are going to have to utilize level 4 scale tracking with the app tracking here. So for example, on here, right, we are scanning the barcode on this balsamic vinegar. And then you can see on here, the entry, it asks us, hey, how many tablespoons did you actually eat? Or how many grams did you actually eat? And so for this type of food, right, maybe like rice and chicken and those kinds of things, we might have to use the scale in order to let the app know how much we actually ate. But here's the cool part about this. For other types of foods, this is why app tracking is so awesome, because we can just scan the barcode or we can just search for it. And if it's just a one single serving amount, then we don't actually have to use the scale at all. And so this is just an example. My wife and I went to the movie theater a couple days ago, and I had a small popcorn. And you can see on here, I didn't have to measure, or scale measure, I should say. I didn't have to scale measure that popcorn because the entry was just, hey, one serving AMC popcorn, boom. 360 calories, tells me all the macronutrients, no scale necessary, right? And then the other thing, hey, let's say, for example, you're going to have some Doritos, right? Here's an entry that I had the other day. It's one package. I know I'm going to eat the entire bag of chips, right? And so I just go ahead and boom, scan the barcode, tells me one package, 253 calories. I got all my macronutrients in there. Boom, add food. Easy peasy, no scale required, okay? And so this is the advantage of app tracking and how it kind of goes hand in hand with scale measuring. And so that's how you actually utilize this as a full system and how to actually do level 5 app tracking. Okay. Now, in terms of a food diary, the other cool thing about level 5 app tracking is that you don't have to worry about a food diary or a separate food diary, because on level 5, unlike all of the other levels that we spoke about, because the app is already tracking and keeping memory of the food, you don't actually have to keep a separate food diary, okay? So that's the other cool thing about this level of food tracking. The other very important common misconception or confusion that I want to go ahead and address over here is the common confusion between grams of food that you have eaten and grams of macronutrients that you have eaten, okay? Because if you are using grams in order to measure the food on your scale, for some people in the beginning, for some students, it can sometimes be confusing for beginner students because they're like, wait a second, I'm measuring my food in grams, okay? And then I have like grams of protein. So does that mean like 100 grams of chicken is 100 grams of protein? Like what's this correlation between grams, okay? Now remember, this is all going to be specific to when you are using grams in order to measure your food, okay? So if you're using the food scale in grams, this is where this confusion might come up, because if you actually measure 100 grams of chicken on your food scale, that does not mean that it's 100 grams of protein, because remember, the chicken isn't made only of protein. There's other things in it as well, right? And so 100 grams of chicken breast, for example, is going to have about 31 grams of protein, okay? Now, this is really only a confusion when you are measuring in grams, because let's say, for example, I said, hey, how many grams of protein are in 8 ounces of chicken breast, okay? So the ounces is what I utilize in order to measure the food, the chicken. And then the grams is how many grams of protein were inside of that 8 ounces of chicken breast, right? And so you can see where the confusion happens when we talk about grams that you weighed the unit in, and then grams of protein. The same thing also applies when we talk about, for example, grams of fat, right? How many grams of fat are in chicken breast? You're going to see, okay, hey, you know what? Grams of fat in 100 grams of chicken breast, there's 3.6 grams of total fat inside of 100 grams of chicken breast, okay? So the big thing here is that this applies to all foods, and you don't want to be confused by this, okay? There's a difference between the unit of measure in which you actually weighed the food, whether that be ounces, pounds, or grams, okay? And then there is the grams of protein. And so 15 ounces of chicken is going to have 100 grams of protein. 0.94 pounds of chicken is going to have 100 grams of protein, right? Same number of grams of protein, 425 grams of chicken is going to have 100 grams of protein. And so it doesn't matter what metric you used, it's different than the grams of the actual macronutrient, okay? And so the important thing to know about this is that there is always a difference in the amount of food that you measured, aka grams versus ounces, and the amount of macros, aka grams of protein, fats, and carbs, okay? Because macronutrients are measured in grams, but food does not necessarily have to be measured in grams, right? Depending on what you choose to use on the food scale, okay? So yes, I know on the surface it can sound confusing because both of them may use the word grams, but once you start to understand the difference, it's very easy to wrap your head around, okay? Now, it's also important to notice, this does apply to different types of food as well, right? So chicken breast is going to have a different gram number of protein than chicken thigh, okay? And so when you actually put it inside of the app, that's when it kind of makes sense for you, right? So if I put on here skinless chicken breast, right, you'll see I ate 200 grams of skinless chicken breast was 46.2 grams of protein and 2.4 grams of fat and 0 grams of carbs, okay? And so there's a difference between the unit of measure of the weight and the unit of, on here, grams of the actual macronutrient. So again, just a important point for me to go ahead and clarify when we actually talk about grams and scale measuring and app tracking and all this kind of stuff, okay? Next up, let's talk about accuracy regarding app tracking. So obviously, the important thing to note is that app tracking is only as accurate as the data that you give it, okay? So because app tracking relies on the previous level, aka scale measuring, some students make the mistake to just assume, hey, you know what? I'm too lazy to actually, use the scale to measure this food. So I'm just going to go ahead and estimate, or I'm going to go ahead and assume how much I ate, regardless of using the scale, and I'm just going to enter that into the app, okay? We already talked about how terrible humans are at guesstimating, at estimating, at eyeballing, okay? Or worse, what students will sometimes do is they'll end up snacking in between meals, or they'll lick the spoon after the serving, right? And not keep track of it in the app. And so if you're not keeping track of all the foods that you are eating inside of the app, this is where it gets possible to have a massive margin of error when the actual amount that the student ate was very different than what was actually tracked inside of the app. Okay, so it's very important to understand that the accuracy of food measuring with app tracking is only as good as the data that you put into it. Now, having said that, there are also different levels of app tracking and different levels of accuracy within this level of food measuring. Okay, stick with me. I know we're like level 5 and we're like level 3, and like within there we got different levels. Trust me, this is the simplest way that I could think of breaking this down for you. I promise you, you will never see this level of simplicity anywhere else, okay? And so this is as simple as it gets. I'm going to push you. I'm going to increase your standard a little bit to think with me and stick with me here, okay? Because what we are doing is we're going to be zooming in to level 5, and we're going to be looking at the different levels of accuracy within this level of food measuring, okay? And so even though level 5 app tracking is the most accurate way to measure food, there are additional levels of accuracy within level 5 app tracking, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and talk about these 3 levels. There are 3 levels that we're gonna talk about. Level 1 is using the app to measure calories only. Level 2 is using the app to measure calories and protein only. And then level 3 is using the app to measure full macros, so protein, fats, and carbs. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is I'm gonna go ahead and touch very lightly on these right here, but I wanna go ahead and emphasize that I'm really not gonna do a deep dive here because there are entire certifications that are just talking about these levels of app tracking. I'm serious, okay? So really, I'm just going to give you a quick overview to the extent that it is helpful for you, but I'm not going to overwhelm you or, vomit on you or, put your brain on fire regarding these. I just want you to stick with me, and it's going to make sense once all of this comes together towards the end of this training. So let's talk about app tracking level 1, which is calories only. Okay. So calories only app tracking is basically when we are going to be utilizing the app and we're really going to be sticking to a calorie ceiling. Okay. And so you or the student is tracking their food inside of the app and making sure not to exceed a certain number of calories. Okay. So let me go ahead and simplify this for you, what all of this means. Okay. What you are doing is you are tracking all of your food inside of the app. Okay. But the only number that you care about is the calorie number, okay? So you can see on here, on this specific day, I ate in like an RX bar, I had a protein shake, and then I had another protein shake, right? And so you can see on here, even though the app is calculating all of the calories, all of the protein, all of the carbs, and all of the fat, the only number that I would care about if I was going to be doing it at level 1 app tracking is I would only be caring about the calorie number on here. So I would not be caring about the protein. I would not care about the grams of carbs. I would not care about the grams of fat. All I care about is that I have a calorie ceiling of 2,023 calories. And so I cannot exceed that calorie ceiling. Okay. So this is level 1 app tracking in which I'm only caring about the calories. I don't care about any of the other macronutrients. I don't care about any of the other grams of anything. Okay. So normally you or the student would be required to stay within a 5 to 10% range of that calorie ceiling. AKA you cannot go over and you cannot go under by more than 5 to 10% of that calorie ceiling. Okay. So at this level of app tracking, level 1, there are no other macronutrient targets. Okay. So the student does not care about the ratio of carbs, fats, or proteins. They only care about that calorie ceiling. Now, obviously the benefit of level 1 app tracking is that for the purposes of weight loss or weight gain, remember what we talked about, the only thing that matters is being in a caloric deficit. And so having that calorie ceiling is going to really ensure that the student stays within that calorie deficit. And so they will 100% lose weight if they abide by this level alone. Okay. However, the negative of only doing level 1 app tracking is that you don't have any targets for any of the other nutrients. And so theoretically, the student could get 100% of their calories from carbs, and it would be acceptable at this level as long as they stayed within 5 to 10% of their calorie ceiling, right? But can you start to see where this level might not be the best? Because if they only ate all of their calories from carbs, it might be an issue, right? And so we're going to talk more about why that might be an issue later on inside of this training, but you can see there are pros and cons to level 1 app tracking. It's easier. It's the easiest out of all of the 3 levels of app tracking. However, there are pros and cons to this when we talk about level 1, okay? Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about level 2 app tracking, okay? We're going to talk about level 2 app tracking. And level 2 app tracking is where we go ahead and have calories and protein. So at this level, you or your student has a calorie ceiling and a protein minimum, okay? So you or the student is tracking their food inside of the app and making sure not to exceed a certain number of calories, and also making sure to hit a minimum number of grams of protein every single day, okay? So as long as the student does not exceed the calorie ceiling and gets the minimum number of grams of protein that they need, they're good, right? And then on top of that, they can really exceed the number of grams of protein as well without a problem. And so at this level of app tracking, we don't really care about carbs and fats. We only care about calories and protein, okay? So let me simplify for you what this actually means with this screenshot, okay? So what we are doing, we have the same exact food that I've eaten from before, right? But if I am going to be doing level 2 app tracking, then what I care about is I care about this calorie ceiling, and I care about this protein minimum right here, okay? I do not care about the grams of carbs, and I do not care about the grams of fat. All I care about is making sure that I am 5 to 10% above or below 2,023 calories, and I want to make sure that I get a minimum of 186 grams of protein in the day. I can exceed it. I can get 200, I can get 300, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter how many grams. I have to get a minimum of 186, but I cannot exceed the calorie ceiling of 2,023 calories. And I don't care about the ratio of carbs and fat. So you can see how we're getting even more accurate at this level of app tracking, okay? So the benefit of level 2 app tracking is that not only is the student going to be able to lose or gain weight because they are staying within that caloric range, but also they are going to be eating enough protein, so that way it's going to help preserve their lean muscle tissue, which is very important because muscle is very difficult to build, okay? Additionally, at level 2 app tracking, there's the additional benefit of that thermic effective food, TEF, right? Because protein by itself can help ensure that fat loss is being burnt more because protein is more difficult and more thermic effect to be able to burn, okay? And so ultimately at this level of app tracking, so long as the student eats within 5 to 10% of their caloric ceiling, which is the maximum, they cannot exceed that, and they get enough grams of protein, which is the minimum, then they're good. They're good to go, okay? Now, I do want to go ahead and emphasize, this is actually one of the most common levels of app tracking. This is the one that I typically myself do as well. And also, when we talk about how much is enough grams of protein, we're going to get to that later inside of this training as well. So that is level 2 of app tracking. And then finally, we have the last level of app tracking, which is full macros, okay? So in the full macros level of app tracking, what we are doing is that we actually have a specific target ceiling for each of the macronutrients, okay? So you or the student is tracking their food inside of the app and making sure not to exceed a certain number of grams of carbs, protein, or fats. And so typically what you're going to do is you're going to stay within 5 to 10% of that ceiling, okay? So you can't go over and you can't go under the amount of macronutrients that are there, okay? And so what that means is that right here, let me simplify it for you, is same thing, we're tracking the food inside of the app, and then this time we actually are going to be abiding by all of the targets that exist. And so what that means is that I cannot exceed 2,023 calories. I cannot exceed 186 grams of protein. I cannot exceed 142 grams of carbs, and I cannot exceed 79 grams of fat, right? These are, of course, my specific macros. Obviously, for the student or for yourself, they're going to be different based on a lot of different factors, right? However, I just want you to understand the point and the purpose behind this is that all of these targets right here, these 3 macronutrient targets, we cannot exceed them by more than 5 or 10% over or 5 to 10% under, okay? So as you can see, level 3 app tracking absolutely is the hardest and requires the most amount of skill. However, the benefit of level 3 app tracking is that students have all of the data regarding the calories, carbs, fats, and proteins, so that way they can make sure that they are hitting them, okay? And so this also helps students, let's say, for example, they have a more particular goal, they're maybe more of an athlete, all that kind of stuff. It helps them make sure that they are hitting all of their macronutrient targets. Now, of course, the negative of doing level 3 app tracking is that it is by far the most difficult food measuring to do, right? Because it does require eating very, very, very specific food choices. Almost sometimes when you get to the end of the day, when I do level 3 app tracking, it's kind of like at the end of the day, you got like 10 calories left, 3 grams of protein, 2 grams of carbs, and like 4 grams of fat. And you're playing like Tetris in order to try and hit these numbers exactly, right? And so this is honestly the level that I will do if I'm very serious about my weight loss and muscle gain goals. But again, it is one of the most difficult levels of app tracking, even though it's the most accurate. Now, on this note of full macro tracking, I do want to also go ahead and talk to you about why counting full macros is actually the same as counting calories, okay? Because here's what I want you to know, is that when you are counting full macros, you are essentially also counting calories. Because if you know that you have eaten 180 grams of carbs, if you know that you've eaten 180 grams of protein, if you know that you've eaten 60 grams of fats, then you actually do know how many calories you've eaten. How? Because it's actually very, very basic math, right? So let's say, for example, I've eaten 180 grams of carbs. Well, I already know that there are 4 calories per gram of carbs, right? And so that means I just multiply 180 times 4. I get 720 calories eaten from carbs. I do the same thing for protein, multiply it there, and I get 720 calories eaten from protein. And then same thing for fats. There are 9 calories per gram of fat. I multiply those two, and I get 540 calories eaten from fat. And then I just go ahead and add all of these numbers up right here. And then just like that, I know that if I've eaten these macronutrient distribution, that I've actually eaten a total of 1,980 calories. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you that is because if somebody is doing full macronutrient distribution with app tracking, they are also basically hitting a calorie target. They are exactly the same thing. Okay, and so that's why if you know how many grams of each macronutrient that you have eaten, you can also calculate how many calories you have eaten as well. So this is just a side note. However, I did want you to understand it so that way you have the full picture of what level 5 app tracking with full macros actually looks like. The other point that's very important to understand when it comes to level 5 food measuring as a whole, not just full macros, I'm just talking about level 5 as a whole, is that level 5 food tracking actually is what creates ultimate freedom. Okay. Now, does level 5 app tracking require discipline? Absolutely. All 3 levels of app tracking, right? We talked about calories only, calories plus protein, and full macros. All 3 of them require discipline because you got to use the app, you got to measure the food on the scale, you got to do that whole thing, scan the barcode, whatever it might be, right? However, it also creates ultimate freedom. Why? Because once you learn the skill of level 5 app tracking, you can literally eat anything that you want and still lose or gain weight. What does that mean? It means that you can literally eat pizza, cake, cookies, ice cream, anything else that you want, and you can still lose weight. Wait a second. Coach Yasin, what are you saying? Yep, you heard me right. With level 5 app tracking, it allows you to literally eat whatever you want and still lose weight because you can eat ice cream all day long and still be in a caloric deficit, okay? This is when we talk about ultimate freedom, this is what we're talking about. And so it does not matter if you're at a party, if it doesn't matter if you're at a vacation, if you're at a restaurant, it does not matter. When you understand level 5 app tracking, regardless of even what level of app tracking you're doing, that's how you get ultimate freedom. How? Guess what? That's exactly what we're going to be talking about towards the end of this training. So stick with me. You're doing phenomenal. I know, this is one of the largest trainings in the entire certification, but I promise you, you're doing phenomenal. You're doing an amazing job. Keep on sticking with me. Again, remember, you can take a break if you need to, but keep on sticking with me. You're doing a great, great, great job. Last couple points I want to go ahead and emphasize when it comes to level 5. Is level 5 practical? Will I do it forever? Here's the thing. Some students are easily going to be able to stick to level 5 app tracking forever. They just make it a part of their lifestyle. However, for other students, level 5 app tracking can be too difficult for them to stick to long term. Okay. And so that's why we have all these other levels of food measuring. Okay. And so level 5 is helpful when somebody is extremely serious about their weight loss and their weight gain, and they're able to really absolutely do it. Yes, in that case, level 5 is absolutely helpful, right? Now, some people might say though, but wait a second, coach, level 5 app tracking, man, I understand, using hunger and fullness scales. I know portion plate. I talk about hand measuring. Okay, I can understand those skills, but using an app on our phone, aren't phones terrible? We should throw them away and all this kind of stuff. No, they're tools, right? And they're helpful for us. And so level 5 app tracking, it's not that it's so unnatural. Yeah, it's so unnatural, but at the same time, what else is so unnatural? Being 30 pounds overweight is also so unnatural, right? And so a lot of times when we think about this, we realize that, man, it has never been, except in the modern time, that we have all of these additional unlimited amounts of food, that we are so overweight as a human species, right? And so as a result, we need to utilize these different tools in order to combat the difficulties that we have in the modern time. And so in the same way that it didn't just become that somebody was 30 pounds overweight overnight, it is going to be a little bit unnatural for us to use some of these different levels of measurement so that way we can get the weight down to a point that's a little bit more healthy, okay? And then once we are at that range where we're a little bit more into maintenance, that's when you can actually use some of these other levels of measuring food in order to really maintain the weight that we would like to be at. I hope that makes sense, okay? So last couple points in terms of level 5, what everybody else does when they teach about food measuring and food tracking. As you can see, this training has been a doozy. This training has not been light. This training has been very, very in-depth. Literally, when I was saying that there are entire certifications, when I say 12 modules that are built all around just this training alone, I am not joking, okay? And so you can see that level 5 app tracking is no walk in the park, right? It literally is very deep. There is a level of sophistication that you need to know. There's a foundational knowledge that you need to have. Now imagine taking somebody who doesn't know anything about food measuring at all, and then imagine taking them directly to level 5, okay? And not just level 5. Let's say you take them directly to level 3 within level 5, right? Full macros. How overwhelming would that be for a student? Think about that for a second. They're at level 0, never did food measuring in their entire life, and then imagine you go directly to full macros, okay? I'm telling you right now, if you ever do that with any student, they're completely going to get overwhelmed and they're going to quit, period. Unfortunately, this is actually exactly what most every other health and nutrition school, colleges, universities, institutes, degrees, or certifications, when they talk about how much to eat, and they talk about science jargon and jumping directly to macros and grams and food scales and all this kind of stuff, they literally do information overwhelm to their students. And then what do you think those students go and do to their students? Exactly the same thing. And so this is what it looks like visually, right? They literally start the student off who has no idea what food measuring even is. They say, hey, you know what? I'm learning a little bit. This is interesting. And then boom, complete overwhelm, vomited on by science jargon. And so exactly the same thing that we spoke about when we talked about energy to burn and how so many different organizations and certifications jump directly from energy you burn to level 5 of metabolism. A lot of certifications do the exact same thing when they talk about energy to eat. They jump directly to level 5 food measuring, okay? And so the bottom line of all of this is that how you are learning how much energy that you should eat, aka food measuring, is so different than every other school, college, university, institute, degree, or certification that does it out there, okay? So few people have the opportunity to learn these concepts in as simple terms as you are learning here at the Remote Wellness Academy. I know some of these trainings are longer, but they are not complicated. They are easy. All you got to do is get through them, okay? And so this is just one of the amazing perks of being an RWA student, okay? You don't get vomited on with science jargon. Your brain doesn't get put on fire. So for that, you are welcome. You are welcome for not being vomited on, and you are welcome for not having your brain put on fire. Your brain might get put on fire because of how long the trainings are sometimes. However, they will not get put on fire because of the complexity of everything, okay? So that's why I urge you guys, if your brain ever goes on fire in terms of the length and the content and you start to get overwhelmed, take a break, take a deep breath, take it step by step, And as long as you just pause, that's the beauty of e-learning, you can always come back to this training. Do not get overwhelmed with it. Last 2 points regarding level 5. I promise we're almost done with this, okay? Activity for level 5 food measuring. Now that you know more about level 5 app tracking, later inside of this training, we are going to actually have you do level 5 app tracking, which is the highest level. And you're going to go ahead and experience that for yourself and what it's like to actually do that. Okay, so we're going to talk about that here shortly inside of the training. So ultimately, why do I need to learn level 5 food measuring? Because ultimately level 5 is the master skill, okay? Because once you can master and once you have learned the skill of level 5 app tracking once in your life, that's it. You're golden. Because this is the skill that you have for the rest of your life. And the cool part about level 5 app tracking is that it pretty much combines all of the other levels of measurement that we talk about. And so in the same way, I've already addressed this over and over and over again. Our ancestors did not have the level of unlimited food that we have. And so these are the new skills that we need to learn so that way we can be equipped for this new world. Okay, so that is the reason why it's important to learn level 5 food measuring, because ultimately level 5 of food measuring is app tracking. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all 5 levels of food measuring. So let's go ahead and really quickly talk about all 5 levels combined, because I really want you to look at how far you've come in your understanding of food measuring. Like, man, think about it. We started off at level 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we all the way went to level 5, okay? Now, one thing it's important to know, as we start to put all of the levels of food measuring together, it's important to remember that for ourselves and for our students, what level we choose for the student. Obviously, if it's a beginner student, we're always going to start them at some of the earlier levels, right? However, even up to what level we decide to take them to is going to be dependent upon the goals of ourselves as well as the goals that we have within health, okay? So if weight loss is an important goal for somebody and they don't have a lot of things going on in their life, then we might build them up to get to the point of some of the higher levels of food measuring. However, if somebody is in the middle of moving, right, and they're moving houses and they don't really have that much weight to lose, then we might not actually focus on the actual higher levels of food measuring. We might focus on level 1 or level 2 and then really primarily focus on maybe something like the blood sugar roller coaster. And so you can see all of these different trainings in this module. There are multiple layers within this and how we approach the student with this as well. Because ultimately, the cardinal rule that you have to remember as a remote wellness practitioner is that you always want to meet the student where they are at, okay? Because the more change that someone needs, the less change they can handle, okay? And so even if we know that we are going to help build this student up to level 5 app tracking, if we know that they won't be able to stick with it, we're not going to go ahead and build them up to that level because we might actually be harming them instead of helping them. And so this is why it's actually very helpful to know the accuracy versus difficulty for each of these 5 levels. And so you can see here, I have this chart on here that we've put together for you guys. And so on this chart, you'll see that we have accuracy and we have difficulty. And so in the very beginning, we have hunger and fullness scale. It's not very difficult, but it's also not very accurate. And then when we get up to the second tier, we have, okay, portion, plate, and hand measuring. Again, a little bit more difficult, not much more difficult, a little bit more difficult, but a little bit more accurate as well. And then finally, we get over here to the third tier where we talk about scale measuring. Again, a lot more accurate, a little bit more, a lot more difficult as well. I say a lot, little, a lot of little, right? And then on top of that, we have app tracking, which again, app tracking is not that much more difficult than actually scale measuring, but it is more accurate. But then we also have 3 levels within app tracking: calories, protein, and full macros. But again, gets more difficult, but with more accuracy. And so for you as a remote wellness practitioner, there's this trade-off between accuracy and difficulty, depending on what is going to be more conducive to the success of the student. Again, do not get overwhelmed with this. We are going to be walking you through on how this is going to look like for your students. But again, you're getting a certification. So I got to kind of walk you through the behind the scenes of all of this. Okay. So ultimately, just because level 5 full macros is the most accurate does not mean that it's the right level for each student. Okay. So again, we're going to walk you through what's going to be best for your transformation program when we get to module 5. In module 5, we're going to help structure all of this so you can see how a student that is your student is going to go through all of this. But for now, just understand that this is all of your toolbox, right? All of this being put together is how you're going to be able to provide value to others inside of the domain for health for the rest of your life. And so isn't it cool when you step back and you start to see how deep your understanding of all of this really is becoming? It's like, man, this isn't some light stuff here. You're going very, very deep within understanding health and the true underlying principles of health. And so this is going to serve you, and it's going to serve your students and everyone around you for a very, 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 very long time into the future. Now, at this point, after learning about all 5 levels of food measuring, it's kind of common for students or some students to really start to feel overwhelmed at this point, okay? Because I know this training has been longer than most. We're really going into some deep, higher level concepts. You're really starting to get the foundations behind how health works. I've really jam-packed inside of this training literally what entire certifications go through, right? People pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go and get degrees on this stuff, to go get other certifications on this stuff. And I've literally jam-packed it in like 1 or 2 different trainings, okay? And so at the end of the day, what I want you to do is I want you to remember that what we are doing inside of this program is we are increasing your standard of how you can learn. We're increasing your standard and holding you to a higher level of accountability because yes, you can do this. Like I've said over and over and over again, this is the beauty of e-learning, is that you're able to really go ahead and break these trainings up, do it at your own pace. But at the end of the day, did you really think that you were going to become a remote wellness practitioner and you thought that measuring food was all about just like having your hunger and fullness skills? Of course not, right? And so yes, you were going to have to understand measuring food at some of these higher levels, but ultimately, this is how you become a world-class practitioner. This is how you do it, okay? And so you're doing a phenomenal job. Keep on chugging through this. And ultimately, I promise you at the end of this, it is going to get easier and easier and easier with repetition. You are not expected to have some sort of test or an exam or anything like this. Again, remember, with experience, this will all become so much easier for you. On top of that, another question that some students have is, hey, am I going to have to talk to my students about this in levels as well? Again, remember, I've gone ahead and kind of addressed this. I want to address this in a different format here. Depending on how advanced the student is, depending on their goals, you may or may not take them to level 5, depending on their goals, okay? So again, remember, it's just important for you as a practitioner to be familiar with, all right? So, beautiful. Now what, right? Now we've gone ahead and talked about how to measure and how to track how much you are eating, right? Remember, that's what we said was going to be the first part of this training, okay? Next, what we can now do is we can go ahead and hit the unpause button on how much to eat, because now that we've gone ahead and gone through all 5 levels of food tracking and food measuring, we can now go ahead and hit the play button on the original question that we wanted to go ahead and answer inside of this training, which is how much to eat. And so when we talk about how much to eat, which is the main topic for this entire training, I promise you it's not going to be as long as when we talk about measuring and tracking food, because now that you understand how to measure and track food, the beautiful thing about this is that it's actually going to get a lot quicker and it's going to get a lot faster. So the bulk of this training, the hard part about this entire training was really that first part, which was how to measure and track food, okay? And so now that we're hitting the play button on how much to eat, what I want you to understand is that this question of how much to eat is going to be divided into 2 parts, which is how many calories should I eat and how many carbs, protein, and fats to eat, aka macros. And so we're going to be dividing this question of how much to eat into either calories or macros, and we're going to address both of those right now, okay? So this is going to go ahead and get to the tail end of this training, and we're going to go ahead and dive into how many calories to eat. That's going to be the very first part that we're going to go ahead and address right now. But before we address that first part, I want to go ahead and let you know, hey, we're getting to another one of those parts. This is one of those parts that, hey, I'm doing a pulse check right here. How are you doing so far? I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to venture out and say this might actually end up being one of the longest trainings and one of the most in-depth trainings inside of the entire program. I'm talking about regardless of phase 1, regardless of phase 2, this training is putting up to be one of the most in-depth trainings for the entire program, the entire Remote Wellness Academy. And so ultimately, you want to be like our friend here who travels the world with his office chair and goes to amazing scenic views, is do a pulse check. Remember, this is a good point inside of the training. If you need a break, You can go ahead and take a break at this point, okay? Remember, you can break up this training. There is no rush. If you need to kind of look up away from the computer, if you got to stand up, move around, this is an amazing part to go ahead and take a break if you need it. And I would highly recommend you do as well, because at this point, your brain is going to start to become like fried scrambled eggs. And so it's highly recommended that as the trainings get longer, the more breaks you actually take, because the human brain can only understand and learn so much in one sitting. And so I would highly recommend and encourage you to go ahead and take a break, sit back, come back to it later on in the day, take an hour, take 2 hours, go to the bathroom, whatever it might be. I highly recommend that you do go ahead and break things up. All right, so we have hit that point in the training where this is going to be a required break, even though we have been recommending breaks throughout this entire training. Like we talked about, do not get overwhelmed. This training is like a seminar, and I promise you, if you do not take a break going through as big of a seminar or as big of a training as you are going through, it's going to be very difficult for you to retain this information. And so otherwise, you're gonna have to go through this training multiple times in order to retain all of the information. Okay, so this is going to be a required break. You want to make sure that if you have been going through the training thus far, all in one sitting, you want to make sure that you come back to this training later. You want to make sure that you do this in at least 2 sittings. You don't want to do this entire training in one sitting. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to retain all of this information. So again, do not get overwhelmed. Just take a break. We chose strategically to go ahead and put all of this together in one training for a lot of different purposes, but that does not mean that you have to sit down and do all of this in one sitting. Okay, so go ahead and take that required break, and then you'll be able to get back into the training from there. All right, welcome back from your break. Now that you've gone ahead and recharged and you are refueled and we are ready to get back into the training, we're going to go ahead and get into the second half of this training. So just as a quick recap, remember, we've gone ahead and finished all 5 levels of measuring food. And now we're going to go ahead and answer the $1 million question that this entire training is about, which is how much to actually eat. And we're going to address this from how many calories to eat, and then we're going to address it from how many carbs, fats, and proteins to eat. So let's go ahead and jump into the first part, which is how many calories to eat. Now, how many calories to eat is actually going to be very straightforward for us to know, given that we now understand how to measure and track food. Why? Because a lot of when we talk about how much to eat or how many calories to eat was already answered in the how much to burn training when we talked about calculating your total daily energy expenditure, okay? And so the number of calories that you eat is ultimately going to be based on your total daily energy expenditure. But here's the difference. When you calculated that number in the previous training, you didn't actually know how to measure and track your food in order to hit that target, right? So you just literally had this random number that was your TDEE, and you had all these factors, and you're like, well, okay, well, what does any of this mean now? You made me do this activity, Coach Yasin, and I had to calculate all these different numbers. Well, guess what? Now you know how to measure and track. So you see how all of this is coming together, right? And so this is why, especially level 5 is so important, because when we answer this question of how many calories to eat, really it applies mainly to level 5 tracking, and if we are doing level 5 tracking. Why? Because none of the other levels of food measuring actually allow us to get a specific number of calories that we are eating. So if you think about level 1, 2, 3, 4, right? We talk about hunger and fullness scale, hand measuring, portions, right? Scale measuring. None of those give us a specific number of calories. It's not until we actually utilize scale measuring and then put those measurements into the app that we actually get a specific calorie number. Now, does that mean, like we talked about in the beginning of this training, that just because I don't have a specific number of calories that I'm eating, that it doesn't matter? Of course not. Your body is always still counting those calories. And so for that reason, when we talk about how many calories you should be eating, even though there's not a specific number, if you're doing some of these other levels of food measuring, you still need to know that yes, you will still get amazing results, even though there's not a specific number, because you will automatically be eating less or more. It's just that there's not a specific calorie number that's tied to it. In the case of, let's say, for example, portion plate, it might be cups. In the case of hand measuring, it might be hand portions, right? Hunger and fullness scale, scale measuring. And so there's not a number of calories per se, But there is a other measurement sort in there that you can increase or decrease depending on how many calories you actually want to eat. I hope that makes sense. And then it's only when we actually get to level 5 app tracking that we get an actual exact number of calories that we are consuming, right? And so here, regardless of what level of app tracking we're talking about, as long as we are inputting all of the food that we eat into the app, it's going to spit out a specific calorie number for us. And so then we can make sure that we are staying within that calorie range if we are doing level 5. But again, remember, you're still counting, quote unquote, counting calories with the other levels of measurement as well, okay? But regardless, this is also why level 5 app tracking is such an important skill to learn, because this entire process becomes much easier when you actually have your TDEE, and that's in calories, and then you have your app that is telling you how many calories you've eaten, and then all of a sudden there's a synergy and a synchronicity that goes on between those two, so it gets a lot easier from there, okay? Now, like I said, can you still lose or gain weight using the other levels of food measuring? Absolutely, right? And so in the same way, if you always eat the same amount of food using your hands, and you do that week by week, and then you start to decrease that amount based off of your food diary, then you will still lose weight. The same applies for portion plate and scale measuring, right? But the only difference, like I just said, is the exact number of calories. And so utilizing TDEE is just not as helpful when you're doing that, okay? So does that all make sense now, how all of this kind of comes together with food measuring? We talked about the calories that you burn. We talked about metabolism. We talked about BMR and NEAT and EAT and TEF. It's all starting to come together in one synchronous kind of picture that you're putting together here. Now, with that being said, this is where I want to go ahead and now talk to you about how to lose fat and how to lose weight while eating pizza and cookies. Because what I want you to remember for a second is, do you remember how we said all diets work? We said that all diets work because of the fact that they put you into a caloric deficit. So it doesn't matter if it's a keto diet, it doesn't matter if it's the air diet. The only way those diets work is they put you into a caloric deficit, right? And so for the purposes of weight loss, we said that there's only one thing that you need to focus on, which is eating less calories than you burn every single day. So at the end of the day, we said energy you eat minus energy you burn equals either gaining, maintenance, or losing, right? But now here's the question. If this is the only thing that we need to focus on when it comes to weight loss, here's the question. Does it matter where the calories come from? And the answer to that question is nope. And so for the purposes of weight loss, I'm going to go ahead and emphasize here, for the purposes of weight loss, there is no such thing as good or bad foods. And so yes, that does mean that you can eat pizza and cake and cookies and still lose weight as long as you are in a caloric deficit. And so for the purposes of weight loss, your body does not know if those calories came from pizza or if it came from something else, okay? Now remember, this is only for the purposes of weight loss, okay? Because what we learned inside of the What to Eat training, maybe you deciding not to eat pizza, cake, and cookies and ice cream and all this kind of stuff because it spikes your blood sugar. So there are other goals that are working with this depending on your different choices and depending on your goals, okay? And so you now see how all of these trainings kind of come together. But for the purposes of weight loss, that's what I wanted to show you, is that obviously for most students who are just beginning, it's very difficult for them to wrap their head around this concept that I just said, right? So much of society is based around good or bad foods. Oh, I can't eat pizza because it's going to make me fat. I can't eat ice cream because it's going to make me fat, and all this kind of stuff. But when you really understand behind the scenes, when you really pop open the engine and you understand the mechanism behind everything, then you understand, wait a second, for the purposes of weight loss, there are no good or bad foods. For most people who don't understand food measuring, pizza just happens to be extremely calorically dense. And so if I eat 4 slices of pizza, I might have eaten like 1,000 calories very easily. And so as a result, it's very easy for people who don't understand food measuring, or they don't understand how food is made up of, they don't understand calories, they don't understand metabolism. It's very easy for them to eat above their caloric maintenance with pizza, cake, and cookies because they're very calorically dense. But if I'm using food measuring, if I understand metabolism, if I understand all of the concepts that we have spoken about inside of these trainings, then I understand, wait a second, I can actually enjoy whatever it is that I want to enjoy and still lose weight if I wanted to. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of what it is that you are learning specifically inside of this training and really inside of this entire module as we start to really pull back the curtain on health. And it's almost like you've been sold to your entire life, right? They've told you, hey, it's so confusing. It's so abstract. You need a PhD in rocket science in order to understand this. So as a solution, you should just buy our next supplement or buy our next diet. When you actually understand the basic foundations, this is behind the scenes, this is behind the curtain, and that's how you have ultimate freedom in what you eat for the rest of your life. How cool is that, right? Really, really, really cool stuff that we're talking about here. Other quick points I want to go ahead and talk about when we talk about how many calories to eat. Caloric deficit. Even though we have calculated how many calories you need to hit your goal and how much of a deficit you need to be in, there are some other important considerations to make in regards to how much of a caloric deficit that you should put yourself or your students in. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are different pros and cons for having a small deficit, an intermediate deficit, and a large deficit. And then in addition to all of the pros and cons, there's different use case scenarios depending on who you are and depending on who the student is as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these. However, they are in the guide as a reference. And then obviously, if you have more questions after going through this, you can just hop on a coaching call and we can walk you through this as well, or you can just ask it in the student community. But regardless, I do want to just go ahead and let you know that those important tips regarding caloric deficits are located inside of the guide. And so the pros and cons of each of the different types of deficits, as well as what type of deficit works best for somebody else. Biggest bottom line thing, just remember that hypocaloric deficits, aka putting yourself in a severe caloric deficit, is unfavorable for metabolic adaptation, like we have spoken about in the last training. And so it's always better to be steady and stable with students step by step. Okay, so that's the point that I wanted to talk to you about that. The next point, as we are talking about this umbrella topic of how many calories to eat, is I want to talk to you about 80% effort does not equal 80% results, and really how bad weekends can damage your progress, okay? Because if you remember, 1 pound of human fat is 3,500 calories. And so that means that you need to eat 3,500 calories less than what your calorie burns to maintain weight in order to burn 1 pound of fat. We already talked about this, right? Literally, this should be like on the back of your head now, right? Especially as we have more and more repetition of this. But here's the thing. You could be doing amazing on your program for 6 out of 7 days. And that would be that, wow, you know what? I did 85% of my week. Amazing. But then guess what? On the last day of the week, you decide, you know what? I've been doing amazing. I should treat myself. I'm going to have a massive burger and a milkshake over the weekend because I went out with my friends. But then guess what? On that last day, which was 1 out of 7 days, on that last day, you actually ended up eating so much more that you put yourself in a caloric surplus for the entire week. And so even though you put in 85% effort, right? 6 out of 7 days, 85% effort. If you ended up blowing your entire caloric deficit on that splurge that you had in the weekend, guess what percentage of results you got? 0%. And so this is what I want to go ahead and emphasize in this section when we talk about how many calories to eat, is that there is a difference between 80% effort and 80% results. 80% effort does not mean 80% results. A lot of people don't understand this, that psychologically, it's different than physiologically. Okay, psychologically, it feels like, yo, wait a second. I did 85% of the effort. Why am I not getting 85% of the results? In the body, physiologically, that's not how it works. This is why 85% effort does not equal 85% results. Okay, and so this is why bad weekends can absolutely destroy your progress that you've made over the entire week. And the crazy part about this is that means that you could be following your program perfectly for 6 out of 7 days, and you could literally still end up gaining weight for the entire week. How crazy is that, right? And so that's why I say when we say psychologically our human brains don't understand this, it's a cognitive bias, it's a cognitive dissonance that we have because we're like, wait a second, 6 out of 7 days I did perfect. I only messed up one day. Well, guess what? The body doesn't know that you just messed up one day. All it knows is that we ate more than we burned over the course of the week. And so therefore that means we're going to gain weight. We're going to store that energy, right? Here's another example because this applies both on the macro level as well as on the zoomed in level. So on the day-to-day basis, you might have eaten 3 out of your 4 meals perfectly. And so if you did 3 out of 4 meals, that means you put in 75% of doing perfect effort. But then, you're like, you know what? I've been doing phenomenal today. 3 out of 4 meals, 75%. Man, you know what? I'm okay with that. Last meal of the day, you decide to have 2 slices of pizza or a few chicken wings, and you end up in a caloric surplus for the day. Now, guess what? What percentage of results are you going to get for that percentage of effort? 0%. How crazy is that? That means that you could have been following your program for 3 out of 4 meals perfectly and still end up gaining weight for the day. Why? Because like I've already talked about, even though psychologically it might feel like, man, I did almost everything perfect for pretty much all the days of the week. I did almost everything perfect for all the meals of the day. In the end, your body doesn't care about psychologically, it only cares about physiologically. You ate more than you burned, and so therefore it gained and stored that energy, okay? And so that's why it's so difficult for so many people to understand this mentally. So if we go ahead and show you a visual example of what this actually looks like, this is what it looks like visually. And there are a lot of cool little kind of images that are out there that kind of demonstrate this, where let's say, for example, your maintenance calories was 2,200 calories, and you're like, you know what? I want to burn 1 pound of fat over the course of a week, and we know 1 pound of fat is 3,500 calories. And so we say, cool, 3,500 calories is what I need to burn. I'm going to divide that by 7. So that means I need to be in a 500 calorie deficit for 7 days, and I will burn 1 pound of fat. Okay, cool. So if my maintenance calories is 2,200, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to eat instead 1,700 calories every single day. So it's 500 less. And so theoretically, if I eat 500 calories less every single day of the week, I will burn 1 pound of fat. So cool. Monday I do phenomenal. Tuesday I do phenomenal. Wednesday I do phenomenal. Thursday I do phenomenal. I'm doing amazing. I'm on a roll, right? And then Friday comes. And Friday, all of a sudden, I go out with the family. I go out with the friends. And then on that day, I've actually eaten 3,400 calories, right? And then Saturday comes and I'm still, on that binge, and I've now eaten 3,700 calories. And then Sunday I start to take it a little bit more in control. I eat 2,500 calories, okay? Now, even though psychologically I feel like, I did better 4 days versus 3 days, right? Shouldn't that matter for anything? Because if you look at the weekly average here, if you average out how much you actually ate over the entire week, you actually ended up eating an average of 2,340 per day for the entire week. And so that means that you will actually store, what is that? 2,200 is your maintenance, 140 calories. Yep. You're going to store 140 calories as fat, right? And so when you look at that, you're like, dang, that's insane. And so you will actually end up gaining weight in this regard. Imagine that. You will end up actually gaining weight if this were to happen. Do you see how this is starting to make sense in terms of the psychological and physiological effects of this, right? Same thing on here, right? We talk about alcohol. A lot of people don't understand that alcohol has a lot of calories. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, doing phenomenal. Friday, spike it up. Saturday, spike it up. Sunday, spike it up, right? My weekly average goal was to be at 2,000 calories. I wanted to maintain weight, right? However, I actually ended up at 2,485 is my weekly average. And so that additional 485 calories per day is going to be stored as fat. And so that actually adds up, because you can imagine it's plus 485 per day. And then it's not long until you do enough days of that where you hit 3,500, and 3,500 equals 1 pound of fat gained. Boom. So now you're actually gaining fat by doing this, okay? And now I want to go ahead and emphasize, this does not only apply to weekends. It also applies to large dinners, snacking, or really just even 1 day out of the week. You can literally wreck your entire progress for the entire week. So you see how we're really pulling back the curtains on you understanding not only what's happening on how many calories you should eat, but also the sophistication behind the scenes. So that way for yourself, your own transformation, as well as for your students, you're not lost. You're understanding, man, yes, I can eat amazingly 6 days out of the week, but I can blow it out of the water on the 7th day, okay? And so this is the difference between losing maybe a fraction of a pound or maybe even gaining a pound, right? When you do that over the course of many, many, many weeks, right? It might take you 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, 6 months in order to lose just a couple pounds. Why? Because you're ending up messing the entire progress up. And so when you pull back the curtain and you see what's actually happening in the body, it all makes sense, okay? And so this is why so many people feel discouraged, because they're like, man, I'm putting in 80% effort. I'm putting in 90% effort. Shouldn't I be getting 80% results, 90% results? Because of the fact that in reality, it doesn't work that way. In reality, these people are setting themselves back by not accounting for the biological aspect of going over on your macronutrients and calories, okay? And so you owe it to yourself when you're going through this entire process to be as accurate as possible. And obviously, we're going to discuss a lot more about this when we talk about connecting nutrition and movement. But really, I just want you to understand the foundations of this, because it's really going to give you that aha light bulb moment to understand exactly how this entire weight loss, weight gain, muscle gain, entire process, how does all of it work? This is the behind the scenes of how it works. Next up, underneath the umbrella of how many calories to eat, I want to go ahead and talk to you about the weight scale. Okay. Do you remember how we said how many calories that you should eat and burn? All of that we said was an estimate, right? We said that. So the question is, how do we actually get the exact number of calories that our metabolism is burning, right? The answer to that is we got to track our weight. What does that mean? It means that every single morning after using the restroom and before we hyperhydrate, we stand on the scale without any clothes on and we get our weight, okay? Once we do that for enough days, and as long as we are being consistent in our inputs, right? We're measuring our food, and then we're also tracking the output. What is the output? The output is the weight on the scale. So the input is the food that we are eating through the measurement, and then the output is the weight on the scale, okay? When we do that for long enough, we get a good idea of like, okay, if I was being consistent in my input, then my output, if it's the same as it was last week or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, then I know that I'm eating at about my maintenance calories. If it's, oh man, I gained weight over the last 2 weeks, then I know that this food that I've been measuring, even if that's calories, right? Even if you do the dang calorie calculator and it tells you to eat 2,200 calories and you're 100,000% sure that you're eating 2,200 calories because you're tracking every morsel of food. But guess what? If you gained weight, that means that guess what? You were still eating above your TDEE. So no matter what the calculator says, your actual TDEE might actually be lower. And so that's actually how much you needed to eat. Or vice versa, right? If you ended up losing weight, then you know that even though the calculator said that this was how much you got to eat, you might be eating too low, too much, all that kind of stuff, okay? Now, after students learn about this concept, some students might come and say, okay, that makes sense. So coach, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and track my weight for 3 days. And I'm also going to track and measure my food. And then boom, I'm going to know exactly what my actual TDEE is, right? Unfortunately not. Why not? The reason why is because your weight actually fluctuates on a daily basis based on a lot of different factors, okay? It can fluctuate based off of if you ate salty food the day before, if you had a lack of sleep, if you had more exercise, if you ladies are on the time of the month, right? If you ate late last night, if you drank more or less water. All of these factors are going to influence your weight. Right? How much can it influence your weight? Literally, it can influence your weight as much as 5 to 10% of your overall weight on a daily basis based on these factors. And so what that means is that for a hypothetical 200-pound person, their weight can fluctuate as much as 10 to 20 pounds every single day. That's a lot. And that's also not taking into consideration the fact that during a weight loss phase of the body actually holds on to more water just in case, right? Because when you're losing weight, when you're eating a caloric deficit, your body is in a heightened state of survival because it's like, oh dang, we're not getting enough resources, we're not getting enough food, we're not getting enough this kind of stuff, right? And so then it holds more to water because out of the two resources, we have food and water. It's going to hold on to water and say, you know what, just in case, because we are in fight or flight mode, we are in survival mode right now because we're in a caloric deficit, it's going to hold on to that water. And so there are many students that we've had who will weigh the exact same weight for 2 weeks. And then overnight, they will literally pee 5 pounds of water out. Okay. Now, does that mean that throughout those 2 weeks, they were not losing fat? Of course not. They were eating under their caloric maintenance. They were eating in a caloric deficit. They were losing weight throughout that time period. However, the human body likes to stay at homeostasis. And so it was holding on to that water weight. And then overnight, it got more comfortable at that new weight. And when it got more comfortable at that new weight, it went ahead and released all of the water that it was holding on to, okay? So what does all of that mean that I just talked about, right? What does all of that mean in regards to the weight scale? It means that although in theory, you can weigh yourself for about a week, and that should give you enough average data to be able to determine if you're eating enough calories or not. The truth is that even that week's worth of data that you collect and you get an average of what your weight actually is, even those numbers may be off. Let's say, for example, if you had a stressful week at work or something like that. But at the end of the day, truthfully, having at least a 1 to 2 weeks worth of data, which is weighing yourself every single morning for 1 to 2 weeks, when determining what changes that you need to make with increasing or decreasing your calories, as long as you're being consistent in how you're measuring your food, that is how you're going to get the most correct answer in regards to how much food you should be eating. It's not going to happen over like, oh, I just weighed myself the next day and like in one day I got exactly the answer that I was looking for in terms of if I'm overeating or not. No, you might have been in a caloric deficit, but then had a lack of sleep and then you weighed more the next day. And so that's why you need at least a week's worth of data to properly get an average of the data and the average of how much you weighed. So that way you can properly get an idea of whether you should increase or decrease your calories. Okay. So as you can see, this is not an overnight process, okay? This is what we tell students all the time. You didn't gain the weight overnight, and so it's not going to disappear overnight. At the end of the day, this is a process. And so what I highly recommend students to do is I highly recommend that instead of really obsessing over the how and the when, because a lot of students, especially with weight loss, especially with getting healthy, a lot of people lack the patience. And the truth is that your body does not adapt very quickly. Even if you're in a caloric deficit, you're not going to just lose 10 pounds overnight. It's not going to happen. And so instead of obsessing over the how and the when so much, it's better to get busy with the process and focusing on your North Stars. And so when you can actually disconnect from the outcome, and then you can start focusing on the process, which like we talked about in module 2, is the next action step, right? You got your North Stars, and then you're going ahead and focusing specifically on the next action step. You're not so much focused on, I got to get the outcome. How is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Disconnect from the outcome, use them as a North Star, and then get busy with the process, control the inputs, measure your food, do all of that kind of stuff. And then everything gets a lot less stressful, okay? So bottom line, because fat loss does not change significantly day to day and happens over a long period of time, as a result, our weight fluctuates daily based on a lot of different factors. And so we need at least a week's worth of data to determine what the actual weight of someone is because of all of these different factors. I hope all of that makes sense. Now, when we start talking about weighing yourself and weighing yourself every morning, it is very common to be able to have students who say, but wait a second, I don't like weighing myself. It really stresses me out, okay? So it's not uncommon for some students, because of their history with body image and because of their history with their weight, they might have a lot of negative belief around weighing themselves. They have a lot of negative association around the scale and weighing themselves and all that kind of stuff, okay? Here's the truth though. The truth and the data and the science is very, 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 very clear on this. Those who weigh themselves every single day or at least a couple times a week are healthier and lose more weight than those who do not, right? Here's a study. On average, those who weighed themselves daily for 6 months lost 13 more pounds than those who did not weigh themselves frequently, right? Does weighing yourself help you lose weight? Yes. Research suggests that you'll be more successful in losing weight and keeping it off in the long run if you weigh yourself more consistently. There's another study that I didn't put on this, is that for those who actually weigh themselves consistently throughout the holidays, there's a lot of studies that have shown they actually put on less weight during the holidays, which is a time that so many people put on weight because we have all of these events and family get-togethers and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, the question is, why does that happen that all of a sudden when I weigh myself, subconsciously I actually end up losing weight? Is it because when I weigh myself, I'm like in a caloric deficit? Of course not, right? We already talked about the weight scale is not going to put you in a caloric deficit. That's only going to happen with the food that you eat. So why does this happen? The reason it happens is because of something we already spoke about, which is the Hawthorne effect, right? We talked about what gets measured gets managed, okay? And so ultimately, that is the reason why when you weigh yourself, you're actually measuring how much you weigh. That's why it gets managed, okay? Now, the other point that some students might have is, wait a second, even though I know all of this, even though this is helpful for me, I still can't get myself, or I still can't get a particular student to weigh themselves regularly, right? They just get too overwhelmed. They're just unable to do it. There's just too much baggage that is going on in regards to their negative association with the scale. And so if that is the case, it is very important to remember the cardinal rule as a remote wellness practitioner, okay? It's that you always must meet the student where they are at. Meet the student where they are at, not where you are at. It's where they are at, okay? Because the more change that someone needs, even though you know that they got to change their beliefs and their thoughts and their emotions around the weight scale, right? Even though you know that, you can't go there and vomit all this on them and then try and put their brain on fire and then try to change their entire life. It's not going to work. They're going to quit. They're going to get overwhelmed and they're not going to want to work with you, okay? And so the more change that someone needs, the less they can handle. And so that means that for yourself and for your students, you might start by easing into this process if this is something that you deal with, right? And obviously for the activity that I'm about to go ahead and have you do, we are going to have you weigh yourself, okay? Now, if you have issues with that, jump on a coaching call, talk to us. We can help you through this process psychologically, okay? But ultimately, what you're going to do is you're really going to want to make sure that you double down for yourself and your students. A lot of the stuff we talked about in module 2, right? We talked about reprogramming your beliefs around the weight scale, okay? That is going to be the key. The key is to understand that the scale number is really just a data point. It's just a measurement of where we are right now. It does not have any implication. It does not mean anything to who we are as a person. There's just a few numbers, regardless if they're a little bit higher or if they're a little bit lower. Because think about it for a second. I just told you right now that the amount of water that you drink impacts your weight on the scale. Okay. And so let's say, for example, I stand on the scale and for myself, let's say, for example, I'm 180. Okay. And then 5 minutes later, I go and I drink, let's say like 1 liter of water. Well, if I go drink a liter of water and I show up on the scale and now I'm like 184, hypothetically, right? I don't know how much a liter of water weighs off the top of my head, but let's say 5 minutes later, I weigh 184. Does that mean all of a sudden I became 4 pounds less of a human being as a result of me drinking 1 liter of water? Of course not. That's silly. Right? And so just to say that the numbers on the scale are a representation of who I am, it doesn't make sense. However, human beings do things that don't make sense and believe things that don't make sense because of, like we talked about, Stockholm syndrome and all those things that our brain's able to do. The brain's an amazing thing that can do all of this. And so what we need to do is we need to work on reprogramming our association with that number on the scale and really start to see it as a data point, okay? And so just like we spoke about right now, by disconnecting yourself from the outcome and instead focusing on the process, aka the next immediate action step, then you're able to release the tension that comes from focusing on the numbers on the scale and really allow yourself to realize what it is. It's just a benchmark. It's just a metric of where I am right now. And when you are informed of the metric, you are more likely to actually get to where you want to go rather than flying blindfolded, which is what we talked about earlier inside of this training. And so with that being said, that's where I want to go ahead and introduce you to your second activity for this specific training. And we're going to go ahead and talk about the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. Okay, so in this activity, what we're actually going to be practicing is we're going to be actually practicing 2 things. The very first thing that we're going to be practicing is level 5 app tracking. We're going to go ahead and practice that. And we're going to be practicing weighing ourselves every single morning. Now, remember, like I said earlier, for most students, jumping directly to level 5 app tracking, not a good recommendation. For most students, jumping directly to being like, boom, weigh yourself every single morning, that's all you got to do, maybe not the best situation, right? However, you are going through this as a remote wellness practitioner. You are going through this as getting your certification. And that's why we're kind of putting you on the fast track to this. But it is very important for me to highlight that it is not necessarily going to be the best approach that you take with your students, okay? But regardless, this activity that you're going to do right now is absolutely critical because it encompasses all of the main points of this training, okay? So unlike the hunger and fullness scale activity where we kind of shortcutted the process and we said, cool, we're going to take it from 6 days, and we're going to go down to 2 days. In this activity, and in this specific one that we're doing right now, we are going to require the completion of all 6 days so that way you can get the full experience, okay? So like we talked about earlier, do not be lazy with this because when you are lazy with this, 2 things are going to happen. Number 1, you're not going to have the experience and it's going to be difficult for you to fake and it's going to have an impact on your income. The second thing is when you are lazy with this, it's going to impact your evaluation for your certification. However, this one is not as important as number 1, okay? You shouldn't care so much about the certification. Yes, it's an added perk. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's a representation of a symbol that you have encapsulated the knowledge and you've properly gone through everything. However, In real life, it does not work like school. And that's why I don't want to ever become like a traditional school education where there's grades and there's like degrees and exams and all that kind of stuff, because it doesn't work in the real world. In the real world, it's all internal motivation for you to actually want to have this experience, okay? And so that's why it's going to be absolutely critical for you to do app tracking properly. Even if you do not plan on doing app tracking for your goals, okay? It's still going to be very important for you to get the full experience, the way that it's designed, so that way you can actually have that experience for your students if they ever get to level 5 app tracking, okay? So I just want to go ahead and emphasize that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hop over to the mini training that is going to be talking about the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into that mini training right now. All right, welcome to this quick mini training about the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. Just as a reminder, as all of the templates and worksheets that we provide inside of the program, make sure you click on File, make a copy. You will not be able to edit this specific template. And so inside of this activity, there are 2 pages, and we're going to go ahead and first talk about the instructions, and then I'll walk you through what the worksheet for this activity looks like. Okay, so typical, just like all of the other 6-day activities, we have part 1 and then we have part 2. Part 1 is all about observation. And so in the first part of this activity, we're not going to make any changes to our diet. All we are going to do is we are going to just track and observe, okay? And so first what we need to do in order to do this observation, and really in order to do the entire activity, is we actually need to make sure we have all of the tools. And so for these tools, we're going to go ahead and need a digital food scale. We're going to need a digital weight scale. We're going to need to download the Lose It app on our iPhone or on our Android phone. And then also we're going to need to put a pen and paper near the digital weight scale in the bathroom. Okay, so these are the 4 things that we need to go ahead and do. Just FYI, the reason we went ahead and recommended the Lose It app on your phone is because it is the free app. Okay, I personally do use Carbon Diet Coach. However, it's $10 a month. Again, you do not need to go out and purchase it. Don't be like, oh, Coach Yasin, that's the one he recommends, so I'm going to go and purchase it. No. Again, remember, they are just tools. I've been doing this a very long time. It's the tool that I like to use the most. In the future, once you get this skill down, we can have a conversation about which tool would be best for you. But for now, just get the free app. It's the easiest, all right? And then you want to just make sure that you have the tools for this activity, all right? Beautiful. Then what you're going to do is every single morning, you're going to start weighing yourself, okay? So every single morning, first thing after you wake up, before eating and drinking, you're going to go ahead and use the restroom. It does not matter if it's number 1 or number 2, right? And so all you got to do is just be consistent. So if every morning you're like, you know what, I don't really feel like going to the bathroom number 2 until like, 10 a.m. or whatever, that's great. Just use number 1 in the morning and then you're good to go. So just keep it consistent, and it doesn't matter that way, okay? Because obviously you are going to be lighter if you do both number 1 and number 2, but ultimately, as long as you're consistent, it doesn't matter. And so what you're going to do is you're going to weigh yourself with no clothes on, and then you're going to go ahead and write down how much you weighed on either the pen and paper that you went ahead and set up, or if you want to go ahead and use it on the worksheet below. The reason I recommend doing it on the pen and paper next to the digital weight scale that you set up in the bathroom is because, it might not be the most hygienic. You have the pen and paper there in the bathroom, but then you also have this worksheet that you've printed out in the bathroom, and then you're going to use the worksheet when you go eat, and then you got this paper that was in the bathroom, and then now you're using it when you eat, and then your hands and all this kind of stuff, right? So my preference and the way that I've always done it is I have a pen and paper in the bathroom that is specifically for tracking my weight every single morning. And then whenever I need the data that is on that piece of paper, I just go in and I just go and get it from the bathroom. I just look at it. Okay, cool. It was, this morning was 180 whatever, 190 whatever. And then I get it and write it on the worksheet separately. Again, totally up to you how you decide to do it logistically, but that is my recommendation on how you should do it. Okay, so that is step number 3 for the activity. Step number 4 for the activity is you're going to go ahead and measure your food throughout the day. So in the morning, you're going to weigh yourself. And now throughout the day, you're going to start to measure your food using the Lose It app and the food scale, okay? And so this is, remember, without making any changes. All you are doing is measuring your current food and logging it inside of the Lose It app. And so if that means that you have to use the food scale, right? If you're eating some, cooked rice or chicken or anything like that, or in many cases, you might not have to use the food scale because you just scan the barcode of the item. Let's say, for example, you decide to have a protein shake and it comes in one of those individually packaged containers. Well, guess what? You just scan the barcode, boom, Lose It already knows exactly what that food is. And then you don't even need the food scale for some foods that you eat. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get away with that for all of the foods. You might end up needing tablespoons and all these other kinds of things. So be it. Point being is that every single morsel of food that enters into your mouth is going to be tracked and measured into the actual Lose It app. Remember, this is without making any changes. All we are doing is just measuring and tracking the food that we are currently eating, regardless of any changes. And then after we do that, what we're going to go ahead and do is at the end of the day, or maybe the next day if you want to kind of do it like that, is we're going to go to the worksheet down below and we are going to fill this in. Now remember, this is going to be an exercise and activity that you do in full. So you do need to make sure that you spend the entire 6 days to do so. And so either at the end of the day or the very next day, what you're going to do is, let's say, for example, this was on like 5/21/2023, right? And now the next morning when I wake up, I go in and I have all this data, right? So 5/22 when I wake up, I go in and fill the data for 5/21 because the day has ended now. And so I go to the bathroom, I look, okay, how much did I weigh on 5/21? Okay, I weighed, 182, whatever it might have been. And then I open up my Lose It app. I go ahead and flip over to the previous day's food diary, food log, and I go in and enter in, okay, how many total calories did I eat? How many grams of carbs? How many grams of protein? And how many grams of fat? Okay. And then you go ahead and repeat that process for 3 days. Okay. Remember, this is the observation, just getting an idea of, okay, currently, what am I actually eating? How much do I actually weigh currently? How many calories total am I eating right now? And how many grams of the macronutrients am I currently eating? Just getting a baseline, okay? That's all we are doing for the first 3 days of the activity, okay? Then, once we actually get to part 2 of this activity, is in the second 3 days, we're going to go ahead and start to experiment and make changes to our calories and our macros, okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and prioritize getting in the minimum number of grams of protein that we need for our body. And we're going to learn that inside of the main training. And so you want to make sure that you continue through the main training so you can have a clear idea of what the guidelines are for getting the minimum number of grams of protein. It's going to be talked about inside of the main training. And then the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to make an effort to stay underneath our calorie ceiling, okay? And so in terms of level 5, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be doing level 5, level 2 for the sake of this, okay? So we don't really care about the carbs and the fats. What we care about is making sure that we stay underneath our calorie ceiling, and that's 5 to 10% under our calorie ceiling. So for example, hypothetically, if my calorie ceiling based off of the goals that I calculated in the previous training, which was the how much to burn training, let's say for my goals, I cannot exceed 2,000 calories, okay? So what that means is that 5 to 10% I am allowed to go over by 10%, and going over by 5 to 10% is going to be between 100 and 200 calories, right? So I'm going to be able to go, so you take 2,000, multiply that by 0.05, and then multiply that by 0.1, and that'll give you the range of what you are allowed to be over by. And so you can be over, you can go between 2,100 and 2,200, okay? Now, better to stay as close to 2,000 as possible. And then under, you can be by 5 to 10%. So you can either be between 1,900, okay, or 1,800, right? So 1,800, you cannot go below 1,800, and you cannot go above 2,200, okay? So that's that 5 to 10% ceiling that we have for the calories. And then the protein, that's just the minimum. And so as long as you get in the minimum number of grams of protein that you need, you can always go above it. It's not like the calories. The calories, you don't want to go above it because more calories means more fat on your body, right? But what we're doing for the protein is the protein minimum. And so we want to make sure that we get the minimum number of protein that we need. And so once you find out what that is, let's say for you, it's 145 grams based off of the recommendations in the main training. Well, you can get 200, you can get 225 if you really want to, but you cannot go under 145. Okay, the maximum that you're allowed to go under is also 5 to 10%. Maximum. Okay, so you want to make sure that you get the minimum number of grams of protein that you need every single day. Okay, so that is the changes that we are going to be making in part 2 as you start to experiment and change in the second 3 days. Okay, also in the second 3 days, we're going to continue to weigh ourselves every single morning, and we're going to continue to measure the food as we normally would from part 1. Except now that we're measuring the food, we're making the effort to make sure that we hit our calorie ceiling and our protein minimum, okay? And then the same thing that we did in part number 1, at the end of every single day or the next day, we're going to come in and we're going to fill in what our weight was, as well as the number of calories, grams, protein, and fats that we ate. Now, you might have a question. You might say, wait a second. Didn't we just say that we didn't care about the calories or the grams of carbs and fats? We only care about the calories of the total calories and the grams of protein, right? Exactly. So let me show you what this looks like in the part 2 worksheet side. So number 1, right over here, once you figure out what your calorie ceiling is going to be, you want to go ahead and write it down right here. Okay, so whatever calorie ceiling you calculated from your TDEE based off of your goals, if you're trying to lose weight, gain weight, maintain, whatever that might look like, you're going to write down your calorie ceiling. Again, remember there's different levels of deficit as well, depending on how fast or how slow you want to lose the weight. And remember, you want to go ahead and also utilize the additional tips that are inside of the main training. So you're going to write that down there. What is the calorie ceiling that you're not going to exceed? And then what is the protein minimum based off of the guidelines that you're going to learn about inside of the main training? What is the protein minimum grams that you need on here? Okay. And then as you do this, you're going to write down your morning weight. You're going to have your total calories eaten. But here's the thing. The app, the Lose It app, is going to also calculate how many grams of carbs and how many grams of fat you've eaten. And so even though we are not trying to set a target of hitting a certain number of grams of carbs or a certain number of grams of fat, it is still going to be in the app. So we might as well measure and actually go ahead and input the data on here, right? But then really, as we are going throughout the day, the only numbers that we care about by the end of the day is, hey, did we stay within 5 to 10% of our calorie ceiling? And did we at least hit the number of grams of protein that we were supposed to hit by the end of the day? Minimum, right? Because it's a protein minimum. And so even though we are going in and putting in the numbers for the total calories, grams of carbs, protein, and fat, really when we are actually setting the targets throughout the day, we only care about these 2 numbers. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, please make sure you let us know inside of the student community so we can help you answer any questions that you might have about that, okay? And so that is a 3-day experiment where we are actually now actively working throughout the day to make sure that we stay at underneath the calorie ceiling, 5 to 10%, and we hit at least bare minimum our protein target, our protein minimum. And we're going to go ahead and do that for 3 days as well. Okay. Now, as you are noticing, 6 days might not feel like enough for you to get the hang of this. And so if you feel like you need to go ahead and extend this for more than 3 days, feel free to do so, right? As long as you need in order to truly master this skill, because this is the skill that is going to allow you to be set free so that way you can truly enjoy whatever it is that you want to eat and really enjoy all of that, okay? So make sure that as you go through the rest of the training is going to explain for you the rest of these guidelines. And so don't just jump into the 6-day food and weight tracking activity without finishing and completing the rest of the main training, okay? So this has been the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. Let us know if you have any questions. This is really going to be an amazing activity for you. It's going to help you level up completely when it comes to understanding health and wellness and weight loss and muscle gain, and all of that is going to make so much more sense to you as you start to go through this activity. So I'm very excited for you to get through it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop back over to the main training. All right, welcome back from that quick mini training about the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. Make sure you follow the instructions. Make sure you do it in full. Don't be lazy about it. It's very important for your experience, okay? Now, having said that, what we have now done is we've gone ahead and finished the first part of that training when we talk about, hey, how much to eat. We said we got to first talk about how many calories to eat. Well, great news. We've gone ahead and finished that first part, which is how many calories to eat. And what we're now going to do is we're now going to go to the second part, which is how many or how much carbs, protein, and fat to eat, aka macros. Okay, so you're doing phenomenal. You're doing amazing. Okay, all these 5 levels of measuring, check. Boom, calories, check. And now we're gonna go ahead and focus specifically on the macros, okay? Now, real quick, real quick, brain on fire yet? You're doing great. Stick with me. We're almost done, literally at the tail end here. I know this training is pretty much longer than normal. Again, remember, the reason we compile this and the reason we made a strategic decision to make some of these longer trainings, I could have gone ahead and broken this training up into like 50 different trainings, right? I could have done it. Every single level of the measurement, food tracking would have been a different training. I could have done that. However, not only would that have been the entire program, right? The entire RWA would have just literally been this training then, or some of the other trainings, right? And then on top of that, you'd have to open up like 10 different guides in order to actually know what the heck, when did he talk about the levels of food tracking? When did he talk about this concept? Now it's all in one training, all put together. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the beauty of e-learning, is that you can pause, you can break it up, you can do it on your own needs. And so just because some of these timestamps on these trainings are longer does not mean that you should rush into it. If I see that you guys are starting to rush into it, I will literally on the next version of this program break these trainings up into like 50 trainings, and this entire program is going to be like 5,000 trainings long. Please don't make me have to do that, okay? Truth is, we make it all in one training so that way it's easy for everyone. Everyone can do it at their own pace. If people need more breaks, awesome, they can take more breaks. If people need less breaks, they can take less breaks as well. So stick with me. You're doing phenomenal. Even though your brain might be a little bit on fire, stick with me. You're doing a really, really, really good job. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about part number 2 of how much to eat, which is how much carbs, protein, and fat to eat. Okay, so if you remember when we talked about what to eat, we talked about what to eat depends heavily on your goals, right? But ultimately we said that as long as you are not spiking and as long as you are not crashing your blood sugar, then at the end of the day, everything else is just gravy, right? It just depends on your goals. And so we said there are different types of goals, depending on if somebody has a weight loss goal, a muscle gain goal, a digestion goal, cardiovascular goal, athletic explosive goals, endurance goals. Everybody has different goals, right? This is where we're going to go ahead and bring all of this full circle. Because what we're going to talk about is the macronutrient targets, carbs, protein, and fats, depending on the different type of goals that everyone has. And the very first type of goal that we're going to go ahead and address right now is specifically around, let's say somebody has a weight loss goal. How much carbs, protein, and fats should they eat if they have a specific weight loss goal? Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask you that question. Does it matter the macronutrient distribution for weight loss? At this point, you should be able to answer that because you know that the only thing that really matters for fat loss really is calories, caloric deficit, right? We already talked about how all diets work. And so in the same way, when we talk about macronutrient distributions, if somebody decided that they wanted to get their caloric deficit by cutting out carbs, okay, so be it. If somebody wanted to be like, you know what, I don't want to cut out any macronutrients. I just want to lose weight by eating less of all of the different types of macronutrients. Okay, so be it. Again, all of this is exactly the same as this. The only difference is that they just did a caloric deficit from a different aspect of things, right? Here, low fat diet. Again, same exact thing. They're still in a caloric deficit. They just chose to be able to cut out a large portion of their fats. And so as a result, they are actually losing weight in a caloric deficit. Same thing, intermittent fasting. Don't get confused by all of these names that are out there, okay? Intermittent fasting, you go from eating all of your daily meals that are 3 meals and you get all of your calories from 3 meals. And then guess what? You eat the same size of the meals, but you just cut out one of the meals. Well, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to be in a caloric deficit, right? And so all of the diets work exactly the same way. They're just putting you into a caloric deficit using different mechanisms. And so for the purposes of weight loss, the actual macronutrient distribution does not matter all that much, okay? And so many people in society insist that there are good foods or bad foods or healthy foods or unhealthy foods, right? The truth is that everything in abundance is bad for you, right? Did you know that you could literally die from drinking too much water, right? You can literally gain weight. You can get fat eating only chicken and broccoli if you ate over your maintenance calories, okay? And so it's so common for people to get stuck in this trap and be like, you know what? Carbs are bad. XYZ is bad, right? And so regardless of your political position, I think one thing that we can all agree on is that we got to make carbs great again. Okay, carbs are not the enemy. Pop-Tarts are not the enemy. Protein is not the enemy. Fats are not the enemy. I literally had all 3 macronutrients here and then just randomly threw in Pop-Tarts there. Just making sure you're paying attention, right? None of these are the enemy. right? You just have to understand where and how each of these macronutrients is used so that way you can use it properly, okay? But for the purposes of weight loss, they all work exactly the same way. It's all about a caloric deficit, okay? Now, unless you have other goals, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what diet you decide to do, as long as you put yourself into a caloric deficit. And I'm going to be giving you a very simple approach to putting yourself into a caloric deficit here in a couple minutes as well, okay? So ultimately, does that make sense? When we talk about putting yourself into a caloric deficit, how much carbs, protein, and fat to eat for a weight loss goal, it does not matter. Now, the next question you might have then after that is, okay, well, what about other goals, right? Let's say that you notice that, you know what? When I eat more carbs, my body has more inflammation, for me specifically, right? In that case, you might put yourself in a more keto diet approach because that's what works better for you, right? Let's say you notice that when you eat later in the day, you're actually less hungry, okay? And so you're like, you know what? I can actually afford to eat later in the day. I like eating later in the day. I typically do skip breakfast. And so as a result, I'm going to go ahead and do intermittent fasting. That might be a good lifestyle for me, right? For somebody who notices that, you know what? Sugar breaks me out into acne. Now, obviously, we talked about how sugar is poison for the body, but sugar, you can't avoid it completely. It's sometimes difficult to avoid completely. Can you avoid it completely? Yes. Do you want to avoid it completely for the rest of your life? Maybe not. And so for that reason, if somebody notices that, you know what, sugar has a very, very adverse effect on me, everybody's body is different. And so for that person, they might decide to have a completely sugar-free approach, okay? And so additionally, on top of that, it's very important that different macros have different purposes within the body, okay? So real quick, I want to just go ahead and summarize on here how much carbs, protein, and fat to eat basically depends on the purpose that you're trying to use the macronutrient for, okay? So carbs typically do provide the body with easily available energy, especially quick energy. And so this is especially helpful for people who want explosive energy in the gym or they're a little bit more active in their lifestyle. They need a little bit more energy. Carbs are definitely going to be the macronutrient that's going to give you that. In terms of how much carbs somebody has to have in a single day, the answer is none. You don't actually have to have any carbs. This is why the keto diet or cutting out carbs completely is a thing. Otherwise, people would be dying left and right when they did the keto diet if you had to have carbs, right? Because the truth is that you can live without having any carbs in your diet because the body is just going to convert protein and fat into energy, right? And so as a result, even though there is no minimum required for carbs, it is a good idea in terms of if you want to have kind of explosive, quick energy, usually even for people who want to feel the best, usually for feeling better, anywhere between 20 and 40% of your calorie intake is coming in from carbs. I know my body, I know my genetics, I know that kind of stuff. I've experimented. I personally prefer lower carbs and higher fats. But again, that's just my personal preference, okay? Next up, let's talk about protein. Protein in the body actually helps preserve lean body mass and muscle. It's also very, very helpful, as we learned in the blood sugar roller coaster, to help regulate blood sugar, okay? So how much protein must you have every single day? Most people, especially women, do not get enough protein every single day because the rule of thumb is that you want to get at least 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So that means that if I weigh 200 pounds, I would multiply that by 0.6, and then I'd take 200 pounds, multiply that by 0.8, and that would give me the minimum and usually the upper range of how much protein I would eat. However, as we also learned previously, there is no maximum for the amount of protein that you should eat. So even this, you can eat more than that if you'd like, okay? So as long as you're getting enough protein that you need every single day, you're good. More protein is not harmful. It's actually not a bad thing to get. And then finally, when we talk about fats, we talk about how fats help regulate hormones and other important functions in the body. How much fat should you get every single day? Typically, it is a good idea to get about 10 to 20% of your calories from fats every single day. However, this is not difficult for most people because even without thinking, you will find that most foods nowadays actually have a lot of fat in them, okay? Same thing goes for carbs, a lot of food. So carbs and fat are actually really, really easy to get, okay? However, here's a cool thing about this. If you are at least getting in your minimum amount of protein, because meat usually comes with both protein and fat, all of those protein sources are already going to have fat in them. And so you really don't have to kind of consciously worry about getting enough fat. As long as you are hitting your protein target, you are typically going to get as much fat as you need. Now, after looking at all of these macronutrients and we talk about how much fat, carbs, and protein to get, You might be wondering, okay, Coach Yasin, this has been like a very long training. We've gone through a lot of information. I did take the required break that you told me to do. And I'm still like, man, how do I put this together in a holistic system? Okay, cool. Let me talk to you about the simple approach, right? Because some students might ask, hey, okay, Coach Yasin, this is all great and all, but is there a simpler way, right? How can I do this in an easier way so that way it's sustainable for me and I can still hit the number of macros that I want to hit every single day? And so here's the truth. The truth is that really the only macronutrient that you must make a conscious effort to prioritize is protein. Why? Because honestly, carbs and fats are very easily found in pretty much all other foods in normal diets, okay? So when you go to a restaurant or on vacation or anything like that, you're gonna find that pretty much every food that you eat has carbs and fat in it. And so what you have to do is you have to make that conscious effort to get the protein in, because that's actually the hard part, okay? And so this simple approach that I'm about to recommend for you right now is that you would go ahead and prioritize getting in your protein first. Why protein? Other than it being difficult to find in normal society, it's difficult to prioritize. On top of that, protein actually also protects your muscles and helps you preserve your lean body mass. Now, at that point, some students might say, but Coach Yasin, I don't have any muscle. I don't go to the gym where I got these massive biceps or these massive quads or anything like that. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not only talking about the muscles that you get when you go to the gym, right? That is also included here, but that's not only what I'm talking about. Because the truth is that even if you don't have extremely muscular arms or legs, you still have lean body mass that has to be preserved on a regular basis, especially when you're in a caloric deficit. And so when you eat protein, what protein does is it actually protects all of that. And then guess what? This is the cool part. The rest of the food, which is the carbs and the fats, are just variable and you can add them in as needed. And so really the cornerstone of this entire simple method that I'm about to walk you through right now is to really, really prioritize the protein first, okay? So let's talk about the simple step-by-step method so that way you can understand how to do this in a sustainable way for the rest of your life, now that you actually understand the food measuring and the metabolism and all that kind of stuff, okay? So this is the simple steps. Step number 1, you're gonna calculate how many calories you need. Simple, easy. You've already done that in the how much to burn training, okay? So example, 2,200 calories needed for this hypothetical person, okay? Step number 2, what you're now going to do is you're going to calculate how many grams of protein that your specific body actually needs, okay? Now, a good rule of thumb for this is that you just take your body weight and you multiply it by 1 gram of protein. So if you weigh 200 pounds, or hypothetically this person that weighs 200 pounds, you just multiply it by 1 gram of protein, and hypothetically, theoretically, this person would have to eat 200 grams of protein per day. Now, even though technically, what we spoke about just a little while ago, technically the calculation for most people is to get between 0.6 and 0.8 body weight per pound. There is no harm if you get over. And so my preference is I typically do always eat more protein than I actually need. And so let's say, for example, I'm weighing 180, I would typically just eat 180 grams of protein because there's no harm in it. However, for some people who it might be too much protein for them, and maybe they're not as used to building up to that yet, they might start off at, 0.6 grams of protein and then work up to 0.8 grams and then get used to eating 1 gram per pound of protein, okay? Now, the next thing you might ask is, okay, well, how in the world am I going to get 200 grams of protein per day without having to app track, right? Because of the fact that I'm showing you the simple way, I'm trying to show you how to be able to leverage scale and the app and all this kind of stuff in a simple way. So here's the secret. Approximately 1 pound of lean meat equals about 100 grams of protein. That's the secret. 100 grams of protein is in approximately 1 pound of lean meat. Okay, so make sure you tell everyone this secret. Okay, this is the super cool, awesome hack to know. So that way you can know how many grams of protein are in a piece of lean meat without having to use the app. How cool is that? And then just for those people who are using different measurements and different metrics, 1 pound is approximately 16 ounces or 453 grams, just in case you're using a different unit of measurement. Okay, so back to our example. For this hypothetical person, this person weighs 200 pounds. So therefore they're going to eat 200 grams of protein. Okay. And for them, because 100 grams of protein is 1 pound of lean meat, they are going to eat 2 pounds of lean meat. I hope you're following so far, okay? Now, some people might say, wow, that's a crazy amount of meat, like 2 pounds of lean meat? Not really. You get used to it after a while. You do it after a long enough time. You build up to it. Your tolerance builds up to that, okay? Now, here's the cool part. For this hypothetical person who needs 2 pounds of lean meat, remember, this is only for this person. It's going to be different for you, but I'm giving you an example hypothetical here, okay? For this hypothetical person, that can literally be 2 pounds of shrimp, tilapia, tenderloin, flank steak, top sirloin, chicken breast, egg beaters. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where they're getting their lean meat protein from. And the cool part about this is that they can mix and match. And so for this example person, they don't have to eat, 2 pounds of shrimp only. Throughout the entire day, they can have a half a pound of 4 different protein sources and really enjoy some variety there as well. But the bottom line is that they got to get 2 pounds of lean meat in because they need 200 grams of protein, and 100 grams of protein is per 1 pound of lean meat. Okay. So I hope this is making sense to you, and this is how you can do it for yourself as well. Now we get into step number 3, okay? Step number 3 of this entire process is now we're going to go ahead and calculate how many calories that we are eating from protein, but with a buffer. How do we do that? Remember how we said that each gram of protein has 4 calories in it, okay? But for this simple method that we're going to talk about, we're actually going to multiply the number of grams of protein that we ate by 5 instead of 4, okay? Why? Because even though technically and actually, there are 4 calories per gram of protein, right? That's how many actually there are. Whenever you eat a source of protein, even if it's extremely lean, there is still going to be some level of fat in it. And so only for the purposes of this simple method, we're going to go ahead and multiply by 5 instead to be able to account for that fat. Okay, now remember, even though this is not technically correct, this is what we're doing for this simple method, okay? So example, let's say this person needed 200 grams of protein, right? This is the hypothetical example person because they weigh 200 pounds. And let's say they went ahead and said, you know what? I want to get today my grams of protein from 2 pounds of steak. They're going to go ahead and multiply that by 5 calories per gram, which is going to account for the protein and the fat. And so now for step number 3 of this simple process, we now have 1,000 calories that came from protein, which now includes the fat buffer in there as well. Okay, so stick with me. I hope this is making sense. We're now going to go ahead and go to step number 4. I'm going to show you exactly how you can eat sustainably and continue to lose weight. Okay, step number 4. We are now going to subtract the protein calories that we calculated from the total calories that we need to eat, okay? And so how we're going to do this is we take our total calories from step number 1. For this hypothetical example person, it was 2,200 total calories. And then we calculated that they're eating 100 calories from protein with that fat buffer. So we subtract that right there. And now we have that this person needs to eat 1,200 calories remaining. Okay, that's step number 4. And then we get to step number 5, and this is the really cool part. Now that we have those 1,200 calories remaining, we can fill up that remaining number of calories with whatever we want. The rest of the food we can eat throughout the day is whatever we want. It does not matter if it comes from protein. It doesn't matter if it comes from carbs. It can be Twizzlers. It can be Reese's Puffs. It can be all of that stuff. It doesn't matter what it is. And so the beautiful thing is that you don't even have to eat the same foods every single day if you don't want to. Now, my recommendation is that you should stick to the same foods because it allows you to have that consistency. It's better for your digestion and all that kind of stuff. But for the purposes of weight loss, for the purposes of sustainable eating, it does not necessarily matter. And so this is how you can have the body that you want by still eating cookies every single day. And so why is this simple approach that I just shared with you so powerful? Is because of the fact that, number 1, it's so freaking simple, right? Isn't it so simple? It's almost like you've been sold your entire life about how complicated diets and weight loss are, right? And so once you know those 2 numbers, right? Those 2 numbers that you need to know, which is how many calories you need to eat and how many grams of protein that you need to eat, okay? The rest of it, you can fill in with whatever you want. And so that way you never have to go on or off a diet ever again, right? And the beautiful thing is you can split those meals up whatever way you want. You can have all of them in one massive meal in the day if you want. You can have them in 5 meals in a day if you want. It doesn't matter. And the beautiful thing, there's no restriction. You can't cheat because nothing is forbidden, okay? And so the reason why people have cravings and urges is because they can't have something, okay? And so when you know that you can't have something, it gets restrictive. You have urges and cravings. But when you can have anything you want, it stops being special, right? So if you eat cookies every single day, it stops being special. You no longer have cravings for eating the cookies, okay? You can have ice cream every day if you want. And when you do it this way, you can't fall off. But remember, the key is that you make sure that you get your protein in every single day, okay? And so also keep in mind, this is assuming that your main priority is weight loss, okay? Keep in mind that you can't go ahead and fill up the rest of your calories with just pure sugar, because like we learned about, sugar can also be poison. It can also spike your blood sugar. All of these are other important considerations that you need to make. So don't just take this simple approach and be like, boom, that's it. It is one aspect to look at, and you want to kind of blend all of these different learnings that you're having to create whatever lifestyle works best for you and your specific body. So a couple other quick points regarding this simple approach. Some students who might try this simple approach might say, hey, you know, I eat whatever I want, but I still get hungry. Okay. So Coach Yasin, I followed this simple approach and ate the remaining amount of calories, and I ate it all with candy. So I actually ended up eating 4 Hershey candy bars. And what I found was I had no calories left over, right? Because I was tracking it in my app, and then I was hungry for the rest of the day. Yes, exactly. And so what you're going to find is that potatoes might be more filling than candy bars. And so depending on your own individual preference for quantity and variety of food, if you actually need more food because you find that you're still so hungry throughout the day, you might actually have to fill up your calories. Instead of eating a bunch of candy, you might actually have to fill up with potatoes and rice, etc., right? And so this is where a lot of those considerations about the blood sugar roller coaster come into place, right? Because when you eat more whole foods, you're getting more bang for your buck. You're getting more quantity, right? Because they're not as calorically dense, right? Versus candy is very calorically dense. And then other people don't really care about how much food they eat. They don't really care about the quantity. They're able to get away with having less food. And so as a result, they're able to get away with eating whatever they want, even if it's just a little bit. And so they can get away with not having to eat as much whole foods, okay? And so remember, it doesn't matter how you split up the calories, whether it's 1 meal or 5 meals, it doesn't matter. And this is going to be where you have to kind of play around to find whatever works best for you. And ultimately, consistency is key. As long as you kind of stick more or less to a lot of the same foods. I typically like to have the same breakfast and lunch, and then I'll switch things up at dinner time, just so that way I have some consistency and I'm not trying to make up some magical meal every single time I got to eat, right? Dinner, I can have fun with it. Lunch, breakfast and lunch, I kind of typically keep the same. The last question that some students will have in regards to this simple approach is they'll say, hey, can I still do other diets? Well, hey, yes, you can, right? Because now the beautiful thing about having all of these different food measuring levels is that it really allows you to have flexible eating, right? Because the beautiful thing about the simple approach I just talked to you about, nothing is off limits. But if you're like, you know what, I don't want to have to do app tracking, I don't want to have to do any of that, you can actually end up doing like a hybrid approach, and you can use other principles from other diets and then utilize that with some of the other lower levels of measuring. So for example, if you're like, you know what, I don't have to mess around with the app or anything like that, then, you know, I'm just going to go ahead and do more of like a keto approach, but you still have to make sure that you're getting in enough protein. That's going to be very important. And then if you have the app, it's still going to at least educate you on, even on the keto diet, whether or not you are eating over your caloric surplus, and then definitely weighing yourself every single day as well. Okay. So for most people, most people, never eating carbs ever again, that level of restriction is just too much. It's not sustainable. And so when you learn these skills the way that I talk about them, it really does create for you that ultimate freedom when it comes to food. And then finally, the last note I want to go ahead and point out is that even though we just talked about the simple approach, when it comes to the 6-day food and weight tracking activity that we talked about earlier that you're going to be doing, you will not be utilizing this simple approach for that, okay? For this activity, because you're going to be getting the full experience, you are going to be doing full app tracking, okay? So then after you've completed this activity, you can switch to the more simple method that we talked about above. But for the specifics of the activity, you're going to have to stick more to what it is that we talked about earlier in the training, okay? And then if you have significant weight to lose, it would still be recommended for you to utilize the app tracking rather than the simple method. And then later on, after you've lost enough weight and you're kind of in control, then you can go and kind of try out the simple method that we talked about when you're looking for more normal and sustainable weight loss. Man, I don't know how you are feeling right now as you are going through this training, but man, for me, this has been one heck of a training. This has been one epic of a training. I would not have wanted to do it any other way. I'm so happy that we went ahead and put this together the way that we did. We were really at the tail end here. We're going to go ahead and put everything together. I want to go ahead and point out this training has been quite the training, right? And the amazing part about it, guess what? We finally have marked off everything when it comes to the energy equation. This has been a long journey in putting all of this together, but you now really understand in these last two trainings, we've literally jam-packed what entire 12 module certifications are about. You got it inside of these two trainings, okay? And so ultimately, this is where we're at in terms of energy that we eat. This is now our new understanding. Energy that you eat is food measuring, how many calories, how many macros, and then the 5 levels of measuring food are there. And so now that you understand each part of the equation, check this out. Think about how cool this is, right? If I had shown you this back when we started this journey, it would not have made any sense to you. And now when you look at this, you say, wow, energy you eat minus energy you burn equals the energy that is either stored, maintained, or lost. We now understand food measuring, TDEE, metabolism, all of the aspects and the levels of both metabolism and the energy that you measure. It's cool. It's very cool, right? So when you look back at all these trainings, you see, wow, yes, they were long. Yes, they were in depth. Yes, they were jam-packed, but you got through them. And that is absolutely amazing. And so as we close out this training here, I want to go ahead and give you a really cool fun fact. Did you know that we actually used to run an entire $1 million company based only on this singular training that you just went through right now? Literally, entire businesses are built around how much to eat. Think about that for a second. This training that you just went through, I know it was longer than most, but entire 6 and 7 figure businesses are based completely on how much to eat. How cool is that, right? And so through that company, we literally coached thousands of people on just losing weight and getting into amazing shape, all because of just this one single W of nutrition, okay? So why did people pay us? In order to help them with literally just one W of nutrition? The reason is because as you've learned, this entire process is much easier said than done, right? And so humans are very bad at being patient, especially when we're riding the roller coaster of thoughts and emotions and the blood sugar roller coaster. And so having someone to remind people of their why and coach them through the mindset portion of this entire process is extremely valuable, because people get frustrated when it comes to measuring their food. They need help with that. People get frustrated when it comes to struggling with consistency. They need help with that. People struggle when it comes to having consistency and lack of knowledge. They need help with that, right? And so now this does not mean, just because I am highlighting for you that we used to run a company that was primarily based on how much to eat, that does not mean that you will also be doing that, right? I'm not saying that, okay? I'm just letting you know what else is possible with the knowledge that you are learning. Additionally, what that means is that all of the coaches here at RWA, we are extremely well versed on the A to Z of this entire process. And so we can answer questions in depth about any of these topics. And so as you're going through your own transformation, as you're learning more about this, this is where we are a resource for you to be able to learn more about that, okay? So this is the power of just this singular W. In fact, prior to RWA, we actually used to teach other people how to build 6-figure businesses online, and teaching them literally how our students would educate their students only on the how much to eat portion. And those students used to make $10,000 to $30,000 a month just helping people with how much to eat. Crazy, right? And the more crazier part about this, in the RWA program, how much to eat, the training that you just went through, is literally just one of the 6 W's of nutrition. And we're going to be going over more pillars when it comes to health. Man, so imagine that with just one of the 6 Ws, we used to have students that were making $10,000 to $30,000 a month with just only a piece of the sliver of information that you are learning inside of this training. Can you imagine how much you're going to know and how much you're going to understand and how much of a transformation making machine that you are going to be by the end of your certification? It's going to be amazing. It's going to be absolutely amazing. So I just want to make sure, is your mind blown yet? Are you feeling like this guy right here, mind blown? Because this is absolutely the power of what it is that you are learning inside of this certification. And so ultimately, this is the void that you fill as an RWP, because now that you've completed this training, you see how foundational this knowledge actually is, right? You see that for the first time in human history, there is unlimited food. And we as humans are not prepared for this new chapter in our history as a species. And so yet, schools and society have failed to teach any of us this foundational knowledge, right? And so what you have learned inside of this training, is going to be really making up the foundation of what every single human being needs to learn just to be a functioning human in the modern world, right? And now that you know and understand this knowledge is going to change the way you and everyone around you sees the world, okay? Is it now making sense how all of this training is going to come together to make you such a valuable remote wellness practitioner? You are literally filling a gap in the market that traditional education and society is not providing, okay? Here at the Remote Wellness Academy, right, we talk about phase 1, remote wellness certification. Do you now see how this module and every training inside of it allows you to have such a deep toolbox and skill set that is going to serve you for the rest of your life? Do you see how this remote wellness certification that you are receiving is your ticket to making 6+ figures online completely remote? Do you now see how this remote wellness certification is what is going to allow you to have financial confidence for the rest of your life? Because this is the skill set in a timeless $1 trillion industry that is going to help you put food on the table for you and your family for the rest of your life, okay? This module and each piece within this module ensures that you are not a one-trick pony as a remote wellness practitioner. You have such a deep toolbox when it comes to allowing you to transform the lives of students from multiple different angles. You are literally transforming your life and the life of everyone around you and your students while providing insane value. And guess what? Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The cool part about this? We're not done yet. We have so much more goodness that is in store, so much more that's going to make you even more valuable to every single human being that you come across for the rest of your life. Because remember this, you may not be ready right now, but through the process, you will become ready. As your brain starts to get infused with all of this understanding that you are going through, right? As you go through some of these longer trainings, you're like, man, I went through that long of a freaking training. I went through this many trainings. It's impossible for me that I will not come out being able to help other people with just a fraction of this knowledge, right? And so this is what we talk about when we talk about the process. In the process, you will become ready. Through this process, you will become a person of value who can charge $1,200, $2,400, $3,600 plus for your transformation programs because of this process and the way that we have outlined it exactly for you. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, that is what I want to go ahead and make clear, because strap in. It's only going to continue to get better from here. Awesome, amazing, phenomenal. Let's go ahead and now talk about, as we close out this training, let's talk about your engagement question for this training. We want to get to know, hey, what are your thoughts on this training about how much to eat, and what did you learn about food measuring? And more importantly, I really want to know this, right? I want to know your thoughts, but really, really, really inside of the comment for this specific training, I want to know, hey, have you ever used, for you specifically, have you ever used any of the 5 levels of food measuring before, right? How extensive is your experience with food measuring? I would love to know that in addition to what you learned from this training, right? Just kind of summarize it for us. And then also, what parts of this training do you think that you would need help with in explaining to your future students, right? You're not going to explain it exactly like this. We're going to talk about exactly how to explain it in Module 5. But before we get to Module 5, right? Just do a brainstorming. Hey, what part of this training felt overwhelming for you? What part of this training didn't feel overwhelming for you? Give us some feedback so that way we can know how to make it even better for you and all of the students, okay? So just as a reminder, don't provide lazy answers. Your engagement in these comments is used to determine your participation for the certification, but more important, like I said, certification is just an added perk. Ultimately, you're doing these engagement questions for your own self, so that way you can have the experience of thinking through what it is that you learned, because that's going to cement that deeper and further into your subconscious. And then finally, let's go ahead and talk about your action steps for this specific training. Inside of this training, we're going to have 10 action steps. Action step number 1, you want to make sure that you watch and study this training in full. Action step number 2, you want to make sure that you complete the engagement questions from this training, the ones that we talked about above, okay? Make sure you give detailed answers for those. Action step number 3, you're going to go ahead and complete the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity, okay? Just remember, instead of doing the full 6 days, we are going to be doing a shortcutted version of that over the course of 2 days, okay? After you complete that activity in action step number 3, you're then going to go ahead and comment on the 6-day hunger and fullness scale activity, and you're going to go ahead and let us know, hey, what did you notice after completing the activity? What did you learn and observe and change from the activity? And what are your thoughts for this activity when you do it for your students? Okay, so now that you've gone through it, after you've gone through it, you want to go ahead and let us know, hey, I'm going to be doing this for my students. What are my thoughts when I am doing this for my students, right? You're not going to be there yet, but you want to kind of prime your brain for that, okay? So that is going to be the second comment post for this training. Action step number 5, you want to purchase a digital food scale. If you don't already have one, we have a recommended one linked inside of the guide, $15. Now, action step number 6, purchase a digital weight scale. If you don't already have one, again, recommended inside of the guide, $20 there. You want to download the Lose It app on your phone, whether that be Apple iPhone or Google Android. And then action step number 8, you're then going to go ahead and complete the 6-day food and weight tracking activity. You want to make sure you complete that in full. And then after that, action step number 9, you're then going to go ahead and comment on the 6-day food and weight tracking activity student community post. Okay, so that means that for this activity, you're going to have 3 full-on comments. The first comment is going to be the main one for the engagement. The second one is going to be for the hunger and fullness scale activity. And then the third comment that you're going to leave is going to be on the 6-day food and weight tracking activity after you complete it. And you're going to let us know, hey, how was your weight trending average over the 6 days? You don't have to tell us your exact weight, but you can go ahead and let us know, hey, I saw that the average weight was going up. I saw the average weight was going down. What did that look like? What did you learn from the 6-day food and weight tracking activity? What did you observe? And what did you change? And then finally, last one. Action step number 10, set up a pen and paper near your digital weight scale in the bathroom after you've gone ahead and completed all the activities and everything like that. And then for the rest of your life, you want to go ahead and start weighing yourself 3 to 4 times a week for the rest of your life. Okay, this single change, as we already talked about, will absolutely transform your life. Remember, first thing in the morning, after using the restroom, butt naked, before drinking fluids. All right, now note, this is different than when you do it for the actual activity, okay? In the above activity, you're going to be weighing yourself for 6 days straight. So you're going to make sure you follow the instructions for the activity. And then after you finish the activity, this is just additional after that you're going to just continue as a habit for yourself ongoing. So that way for the rest of your life, you can measure and manage your weight going forward. And that, ladies and gentlemen, has been pretty much what we call, this is like the seminar on how much to eat. It's not just a training. This is like an entire seminar on how much to eat. You got through it. Congratulations. It's time now to get to the action steps and really start knocking out these action steps and making sure that you can get the experience from all of them. This is Coach Yasin checking out, and I will catch you inside of the next training.